Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Murasaki in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 71, The Wicked Child. Through the moon-tipped grass, serpents yawning, hither they come, nurtured by night's descent. Winter's ghost roughed his cheeks spring's lament, and lamented she had, courted, and murdered on white. And boughs froze in place, almost in fear, with settled dew. In the glinting of pearls, moon cooed, and frustrated night. Still wanton and sweet like love. Was it coming at last, winter's song all sewn up unto the sweetness of his throat? Lying deep, flesh, bone, and blood, heated to a rapturous tune that had manifested in the now rotten, but once winter, womb of his widowed mother, winter fire spirit. Touched by youth's musk, he had grown all beautiful and sublime. Still not like the lily of autumn, but who would not change a moth for a lily? Silly woman! She had wept and bled in love for him, from eyes wanting and juncture burdened and wet, and through lids apart, she saw his face, such love in the face of Lord, such lament in the eyes of the little devil. Oh, child, wicked, wicked child, you grow distant, wild. How things lay forgotten, like people, in the deep of earth. How things lay forgotten in the deep of his mind. Such a wondrous winter, such a wicked man. Germinating outside the ripe refuge for so long in the hall, his presence was mild. Cheeks the whitest white, lips touched by the airs of spring, but only just a playful kiss by a giddy maiden before she ran away, sleeves streaming like paper scrolls in wind. The shade was still not mature, not deep, not like love. On the ceiling, in the gray of shadow, 8 fingers adorned with innumerable prickly hairs crafted threads delicately, and like memories, they invited death upon their structures stuck to the gossamer it had made. Moths died a bad death, but tonight was a different night, and death came on purple wings singing. Its wings, sinister instruments, beat and beat like his heart, unrelenting. The spider with hairy legs lunged and bit the outer skin bloated with poison, in uncontrolled hunger. Winter did not bring the juicy ones to his phantasmal abode, not this time. Just one bite and it wilted and died in the trick of threads, a home and a grave, and from the faintest glimmers of cobwebs, a delicate color spread to him and spilt across one side of his face, which bore all details of this sudden demise. So white, like a scroll which invited touch, his face was created to endure shadow's colors. As if he felt the last twitches of a mother's fingers on his cheek, he gazed for a moment at the web that hung between the hall and the moon still dim in infancy, and this time, his whole face exhibited a play of shadows for children's eyes. The spider floated away into the forest, an empty husk, and freed of the less than mighty strings, fragile as though the spider had turned moon's songs into threads with love burning in its fingers. It flew to him in hunger. His chakra was the most delicious thing it would ever feast on, overflowing with its seduction. On his lips it found its refuge and laid its tiny feet there with a resolve and kissed the breaths that came from him, breaths with life's flowing, and in this month of autumn, this life was especially ripe, glutted with energy he would never be able to put forth in any other month. The young commander is distracted by moths, spoke a voice that boomed loud and distinct in the hall that was empty. Almost surprised, he turned his head sharply, and at this rude dismissal, the moth flew away with a broken heart, and it pulled the shadow with it, but not before it took a piece of his love, too. He immediately prostrated before the daimyo, and then he sat up straight. "Forgive me, I did not hear you come," he spoke, and though his voice was soft as wings, its resonance was felt for several moments. The daimyo smiled, but his smile was a little unperceivable without his clan's hard focus and red scrutiny. It was dark, but the fire from the tall bronze candle stand set alight the yellow silk in the lord's vestments. It seemed as though the tailor had threaded chrysanthemums into his beautiful robes, Kiku's sunning. He noticed that the lord had chosen not to wear his eboshi. Traditions were not always followed, and that revealed the shaven front of the head, anointed generously with oil that it shone with a peculiar effect in the light's warmth. This man was Shiba Yoshimune of the Shiba clan, and he was the daimyo of this land. He sat on the raised platform, looking down upon the boy whom he had seen grow through the seasons that assaulted Konoha each year, but the spring, winters were especially harsh to the lands that favored the love of spring and warmth of summer, in which flowers bloomed fragrant and fruits succulent, and he carried a beautiful sword and a folding fan at his waist, symbols of stature. Had the lord sent the page away? He did not even notice, so love-struck by his creature companion in soul, who had flown away and taken his wings. So the journey back home would be flightless? Yoshimune kept quiet, listening, smelling, seeing the creations of nature in this hour of night. White flashes broke over the empty shores of this room in waves. Another storm was coming, a mighty one, and it made a feeling of such restlessness invade the peace of the boy's heart, utterly. I smell the earth, Yoshimune spoke and took in a breath. The storms have been unkind lately. Then he was quiet, his eyes surveying the shadow lattice stamps upon the wooden floor's artificial white. Several moments passed by in this unneeded silence from men and noise from outside, and Itaka was forced to cast his gaze on the floor, almost helpless to compel this man to speak. What brings the young Uchiha heir here when the night is cold and harsh? He asked, at last, and his smile was a groove in his face, the delightful interplay of dim light and light dark crafted. Itaka pulled up his gaze to look at the man who would be an anchor for him, should he ever choose to be, and nature's sense wafted in, settled over the room, enriched his senses. He breathed in once, just once, and his mind was ready to work at this problem, again. I seek your permission to speak with honesty, Itaka spoke and steeled his neck more than he steeled his spine. The daimyo, an unrepentant ruler, observed his face with a countenance that foretold his skepticism. However, much to Itaka's delight, Yoshimune's curiosity overwhelmed his reservations too soon to matter, and he had been loyal to him, murdering his foes in their beds at his command. He deserved this much, or at least, he hoped he did. Honesty. Yoshimune repeated, his tone brimming with a curious change, his smiling lips smiling deeper. Oh, he had become much too curious, and this change made Itaka happy. Almost. Itaka did not speak, no, he waited, for he could not start the conversation without this lord's permission. He saw a twinkle in Yoshimune's eyes, it was like the last blinking light of a lost firefly before morn, then it vanished, and he gave a slight nod of his head like some thought had passed in his mind. Itaka gave a low bow of acknowledgement and sat so straight and settled his whitest hands on his thighs, eyes iron, face flower. And that disposition, a delicious blend, made the lord's heart soft to him and his tongue. The youth's wickedness was tongueless, his charm, wordless. And he was charmed already, as though he had bedded the young heir in the lush chambers of his free will. Such was his wont. Oh, but the scandal would ruin him. His fantasy was surely elaborate. I have come here to speak of the Hokage, Itaka spoke, his voice harder than iron, softer than flour. She has made questionable decisions that push Konoha towards peril with each passing day. Yoshimune did not speak, heart roused by the man in him, gaze enflamed by the man before him. The storm had found a place in his spirit, a restless storm, and it would not leave here without his ruination, and he was so innocent, lovely, boy-like that the lord's heart could not bear to turn him away even when his mind's doubts sought to puncture the unmissable sentiment with repeated interruptions. She has taken decisions. Rash decisions that have placed Leaf in danger's path. Itaka paused, his words vibrating and haunting about the lord, like fairies cold and deadly. She had the lady of the Okamai clan assassinated in spite of my reservations. As a consequence of this murder, bandit clans have gathered in great numbers round the village. Danzo is up to no good, and she does nothing to prevent this. I fear that he may have been directing the young girl's decisions with her consent, to spark a war against Cloud. Without your knowledge. Yoshimune emitted a pleasant laugh that went back and forth across the hall like a flexible object. Its tinkling sound made an unpleasant sensation well up in Itaka's throat, but it was not potent enough to manifest on his face, which stayed the same just as winter stayed the same. Danzo has many words to spare for you and your mischievous little brother. Suzuki, was it? Yoshimune spoke, and though Itaka had expected this, the sound of his voice was still louder than the foreign sounds in the gurgling skies for his ears. Tatsuoki has made many unpleasant claims. Murders of Fu and Torun. Unpleasant business, young heir. Fu's unfortunate murder remains a mystery, though I fear his frequent Nightflower Village visitations may have been the cause. No evidence against Suzuki was found. I do not know why he keeps insisting upon this without a reason, without a cause. Itaka spoke and watched as the daimyo bent forward just a little to lend his ears to Itaka's tricky tongue. The lack of light made prominent the deep furrows in his brow. Nature was never kind to the ones without youth, and waxing candles made nature appear even less kind. He appeared to be a frail man in a kingly garb. He was no ruler, this bearing was a fool's trick. "And Torun?" he asked, pulling out the fan tucked in his belt, opening it with an easy flick of his wrist. "2 murders, young heir. It is not fair to accuse Danzo so soon. Perhaps your brother is disobedient, after all." And when he smiled this time, beneath the graying layer, his smile was cruel, framed in a face mapped by wayward lines now animated by his facial muscles in unnatural ways that Itaka did not like, nor enjoy. Lights crashed into the room and splattered across the floor in a color that was singular and sharp and bright, and the heir's jealous heart was loath to grant this lord the satisfaction of murdering the child, being the master of the child's soul, his only child. He ought to be the one to decide his child's fate, and what was this lord to his heart? Yet another man to be forgotten and kept in the graveyard of memories. "If the boy is found guilty, I will put him to death myself right here in front of you, my lord." He spoke with such sincerity that the lord's heart was moved, and then it was moved to despair and frustration by the smile on the heir's face, a smile that disturbed the pristine nature of a flower as it stood shuddering in wind. It was like a single out-of-order petal that made the flower lovelier still. "I appreciate your loyalty. I wish more men shared it with you." Yoshimune spoke in a voice as though he was in love, a softness that echoed a time of his youth and all its much-coveted frivolities now lost to this constant fever that wrestled and lay defeated in an old man's body. "Terrible business, of course. Your accusations paint Tsunade in a foul light. Do you possess any evidence?" And a parasite born of treachery stitched itself to attack his spirit, and when the process was complete, a heresy committed by the once divine hands, he could not help but feel a single shudder rock his core with tremors that were delightful. His mother's womb had spoiled his spirit, a milk left out in the open for too long its sanctuary was myth. And his soul had come alight, dancing like an apparatus undone and recreated by the devil's hands. This was easy, this was divine, this was justice. "No, I do not," Itaka spoke, "but I intend to look into the matter. I humbly request your discretion. Your life may be in danger." "Danger?" "The young heir makes frightening claims," Yoshimune spoke with a polite laughter that tinkled like bells in his throat, though the vibrating sound had little effect on the room's atmosphere. "These are fears. For now. I will not rest till I am not satisfied that my suspicions are just suspicions." He spoke and assuaged the red devils in his eyes, albeit they burnt just beneath the layers that presented an easy breach for their beguiling influence. "A matter of silence," Yoshimune whispered, eyes looking up, heart enjoying the thrill of danger in this age that was all it took to set it going at a pace he liked. "You may leave," Yoshimune spoke and stood up, and so did Itaka. "I will call upon you if need be, but you ought to be sincere about that Torun business. If you come through, we shall see." Then he observed the heir bow and his heart took a single leap in anger and he left the heir and his growing shadow all alone. His moth had come back to visit again. Itaka walked towards the main door, through the wings of this young moon's light, spreading out. They produced a sacred effect when they struck hanging screens mounted on walls just below the roof, with motifs of Kirin dancing and snow dotting the still lush gardens and fragrant flowers that were nourished by spring past its prime. Its cradle was rich and divine in the absoluteness of dried-up paint. Strange, what one could create in paintings. "You play hide and seek," spoke a rich voice from behind, and Itaka was forced to stop immediately. He turned around, slowly, and from the devious shadows figure that had hidden from his human eyes appeared a man brushed by dove wings of night. Plumes brushed across his luxuriant garments, red kikus burning like mighty fires right upon his heart. Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man Itaka was not expecting to see in the frozen bowls of this night. Ieyasu moved towards him, his gait so smooth as though he was floating on a lake's sighing water. He stopped just 2 steps short of him, his face white and unreadable, his eyes hard and unbearable. Smooth black hair framed his high cheeks, made to appear much too white by this childlike moon, that had been hardened much by his nature. 3 and 9 years of age, Ieyasu was still young, appointed as the head of his clan after much bloodshed. In his face calm and storm blent sharply. He possessed a disarming countenance that was decorated by a delicate pair of eyes, his mother's parting gift, starred with a marked glint of forbearance and chaos, a devious duality and thick lashes that afforded them the skill of mystery. His features, smooth, pointed, and sharp, habitually serene till visited upon by an arrogant mark of cleverness Itaka had no wish to witness now. Ieyasu spoke not a word, and Itake, out of habit, bent his head to bow. "My lord," Itake whispered and stood straight and looked the man before him in the eyes that were crafted from the stone heart of the deepest cold winter could muster. He said nothing in return and began walking to the garden from where Moon's remnants emerged like fairies to crucify themselves upon walls, without a single sign of martyrdom, and though Itake had no desire to accompany him, he did, for he was obedient ever since he opened his heart to this country's greatest will. His steps made faint sounds, but Ieyasu was quiet like the shadow whose refuge he took earlier to surprise him. Outside, Moon hanged high above them in slumbering delight, quiet and pristine in this cold, cold night. By the door, dim light-bearing lanterns hung, their lights shyer than the moon's. It was bolder tonight, innocent and young, shining upon lilies smiling by the stream that went along cooing in sleep, creating black strokes of trees on stocky walls. Ieyasu gazed up at the moon, and then he looked down and gazed at him, a question just beginning to blossom in his eyes, and Itake felt that he should speak. "I came by to..." "Oh, hush!" Ieyasu cut across him, his voice like steel, frigid and deep. "You little snake. Always the opportunist. You thought you could come here and make a mess of things in my absence." His eyes wandered slightly to the right and returned back to Itake, with a fire in their depths. "You leave," he commanded without looking at the man whom he had no desire to name, and when Serizawa did not leave, a smile almost invaded the expressionlessness upon his countenance. "He wishes to be disobedient like his master." "Serizawa," Itake spoke, turning his head a little to show him a shadow of his disapproving eye. His second sight had not risen. Serizawa, a shadow, did not protest. He bowed and left, and all shadows remained behind, save his. Mist coils lingered about them and upon the garden clothed in bright verdure, ghostly winter mirages, and sparkling droplets from the storm whose breeze whispered the farewells fell upon their garments and exposed skin. It was cold, so cold. "Your brother writes lovely missives to me, and I grant his wishes, for I enjoy his company. I have granted one such wish that exists in my pocket. He is endearing, unlike you, takes after his father." "No." Ieyasu spoke, his features cast in the dimmest shadow Itake's body threw upon him. Ieyasu was just as tall as he was. Perhaps slightly taller. "Where is Meru? I sent you missives to bring him to me, but you said nothing. When did you turn so arrogant?" "He is safe," Itake spoke and drew in a breath that was soft and without sound. It did not even disturb the air about them, the air winter's seduction made heavy. "Oh? Am I to hang upon your every word without seeing a thing? Take a leap of faith? Is that why you are here, to charm the senile old fool that pines for you and speak to him of the terrible things I have made you do?" He spoke and a ghost of mischievous disdain trembled in his smile. Itake kept looking, his face and lips in a state of calm. "You are bold the way you gaze upon me. Perhaps I should pluck out your pretty eyes. Then what would become of the little boy like you? Nothing good." Itake lowered his eyes and settled them on the breast of the man in front. He did not know what oceans raged inside the violent cradle of Ieyasu's heart. Itake's eyes were not swords tonight, swords not sharp enough to cleave the turbulent surface of swelling waves. The man nurtured bifurcated impulses that festered unchecked in his spirit womb, volatile and dangerous. He was not a foe Itake wished to battle. "I want Meru in my care before this moon turns full. I do not care where you are hiding him. Bring him to me," he spoke, his breaths white, falling across Itake's face adorned with moonstruck droplets traveling down his contours, with no sense of direction. "This thing you ask of me, it is not easy," Itake spoke, and this time, he chose to meet Ieyasu's eyes with a fire that matched the birthright from his father, without the color's intense presence. "The Hokage has created troubles. Danzo's men keep watch on the village in great numbers. They will get a whiff of this. It is only a matter of time. Ah, licking the cage's sandals all day long has made a frightened whelp out of you," he spoke, and shadows of clouds obscured the moon glowing on his face. "I did not whisper in this old fool's ears of your glory for nothing. Why are you not forthcoming, Itake? You were such an obedient boy before you took the great seat and became important, obedient in your office, obedient in my bed. Now, you are just an obscenely pretty, conniving wench." Flashes leapt from an angry belly and a hard-placed light appeared over Itake's face with ineffable sweetness. His visible face had gone colder, whiter, harder. He did not speak, he had no word dancing on the tongue's tip, This man had come with claws to cut off his wings. In the divine shower of weightless rain from sky's brink, Ieyasu was visual noise, and Itaka did not know how to muffle its loud timbre for his eyes' respite. There was a steady impulse to meet this force with one of his own making, yet he did not have it in him to conjure the imagery recorded by the Sherinon without his approval. The eyes had a mind of their own, and their machination was like a walk into the den of somnambulists that stood delirious amidst the swirling opioid fumes. It was all dream and dreamlike in the reds and depths of his clan's eyes. 1 and 7 years of age, he was just as lovely in the dawn of youth's season, he was just as obedient in the dawn of his lord's reason. An obsession blossomed into a full flower in the pits of his heart, and every word, every gesture was a divine part. They spoke, he acted; they asked, he reacted. A toy in their hands, a seed in these lands. He was blessed. When the land yearned, his spirit turned. The will turned him loose upon her foes, and he obeyed with head bent, sword in hand and heart, fire in breath and breast. He was a cruel soldier with the most cruel eyes. This was not the gift his father had granted him through the benign act of creation. His mother wept in love, yet her tears never touched and thawed his heart. Winter's yearning sowed a devil in her womb. And when Ieyasu asked of him to satisfy a personal yearning, he did not deny him. He could not, for he was his lord, and his will was this land's will. Ieyasu touched him in tender and perverse ways, kissed his throat and flesh the way a woman would, acts he did not enjoy, yet he stayed silent and obedient till Ieyasu grew bored of him one night. Before he had lived through 1 and 9 winters, he never called upon him again. Yet this seed had grown and matured whilst eating winter's winds and waters. His heart was harder and colder, his spirit, less prone to heed the sensations that made it soft. Years sowed a course of tenderness in his heart, and none existed to rouse it from eternity. But his child that planted a kiss of life upon the lips and made tremble the apparatus for holy pleasures that danced serene and pure in his eyes. Ah, what fleeting flashes of fancy they seldom stayed! An obsession with the will, a love for the land, vices I adored. Why do you withhold the vices from me now? Ieyasu spoke again, voice dripping with past's yearning, taking advantage of his subordinate's silence. Shall I take you to bed again? You do not seem to have any other use. And he tapped the fan that he held in his hand against Itaka's cheek, lightly, his expression placid, his smile sweetened by scorn. Look at you. Still so pretty, almost like a woman, like a well-paid harlot. Ieyasu sighed out in gentle mockery, looking at Itaka up and down, assessing him with a sluggish gaze. You bring that man to me. I do not know why you are forgetful of my generosity to grant you this power in Konoha. Without me, you are nothing, you would be nothing. Do not play games with me, or I shall make a woman out of you, and then you can moan like a whore in my chambers, something I would enjoy rather than seeing this stone-cold face you wear and lending ears to your lying tongue that brings me no joy. Ieyasu smiled, and his smile was sincere. He made to walk, but suddenly, as if gripped by the tenderness of moon's waters flowing down Itaka's countenance, he stopped, and added, either you accept your position or I decide your fate and put another dog in charge of your clan, some eager man from your council. You can displease me and gain my favor only so many times till I tire of you, and you are in a habit of boring me. Mind your manners. And then he left Itaka alone to gather bits and pieces of his shadow. He watched as Ieyasu's shadow moved across the paper screen windows, invading sceneries one by one. Then his gaze fell upon Hanakoto's face, illuminated by the lantern that hung by the latticed window. She possessed great beauty that its radiance dimmed the moon's light. She wore a red kimono and sat beside a low black lacquered table that bore teacups and a lustrous old urn, and she smiled at him with smiling eyes, passion radiating from her mouth and cheeks. Ieyasu sat down beside her, and his demeanor changed. He appeared playful in her company. Itaka could imagine she had that effect on men. Itaka looked away, enamored by lights swirling amidst shadows this maturing night generated. Then, as silently as he had come, he left the place the same way his journey home would be without wings. My lord, you are harsh with him, Hanakoto spoke, moving her fan back and forth. Be gentle. He does not deserve gentleness, Ieyasu spoke, and a recovering smile came across his lips in visible traces. Enough of him. What brings you here? She moved her hand lightly in a circular motion, twice, trying to get a whiff of a fragrance that emanated from him. Is that sake I smell in your breath? I hope you still have the appetite for enjoying tea with me, she spoke, placed her fan on the table that had lost half its luster, and poured out tea into 2 teacups. "I am a little intoxicated, yes," he confessed, his smile full and radiant now, "though my constitution is not delicate enough to sour my memories of you." She let out the lightest laugh, rose color appearing darker on her loveliest face. "I flatter men without payment tonight, you flatter me without payment, my lord," she spoke, holding her smile, and placed the cup before him. "I came here to discuss the Yoshiwara business. Men from the neighboring bathhouses have become nosy. I want them gone. If you grant me the permission and means to expand the place, it will bring me the greatest joy and relief. This matter has stolen my nights. It gives me worry. I make less than I ought to. The daimyo here is unfair to me. That is unfortunate, but do not worry, worry would age you." Ieyasu spoke and took a quick sip of the tea that was still warm. "I would not want that. Your face is more beautiful than the moon and flowers." Hanakoto lowered her eyes, and head and jewels that adorned the pins in her hair tinkled like charms. Her lips sweeter than the sweetest sake, her face lovelier than the loveliest flower, lesser than lily. She was autumn's apparition, vapors about the dead, that haunted the deep of winter's dreams, a red tenant of its passions. "I can enforce more stringent measures and grant you funds for expansions. Of course, that would require time and persuasion." He spoke and placed the empty cup back on the table. "In the meantime, why do you not think over my request?" "Why, I am too old to be your concubine, my lord." She spoke, expressing surprise, her eyebrows floating up. "Perhaps a blooming Teu might delight you. A new Takao has completed her training. She would be obedient in your company. She writes lovely songs, too. You would enjoy them. Has Kami left a mark of age on you that I have not seen? Perhaps it is hidden underneath the delicate layers of your kimono?" he asked, eyes twinkling in the lantern's light that touched the red in her kimono and made her appear like an enticing flower on Sanzu River's misty shores. "The dead would surely be tempted. You should have tied your obi at the front. My, you are playful. Come here and sit by my side, with your back to me. I want to see you, all of you, in this light." Ieyasu spoke, words crafted by his passions. Hanakoto did not protest. She rose to her feet, a delicate layer clutched in her hand, walked to him, sat down with obedience in her movements. She felt his hands on the knot, and he undid it with expert hands. Her skin was smooth when the layers fell away, her hair, delicate paintbrush. "You are very lovely. Imagine that I have done what you asked. Sing for me," Ieyasu whispered and touched the visible sinews in her back, and warm breaths issued forth from her lips. He kissed the vein in her neck. It was unusually bright green underneath her flower-white skin, as if awaiting a different liquid to give it another hue. And the scent of higanbana blew from the expanse of her breathing pores, upon which stood signs of her flesh's heat. He was more gentle with her than her love was when he was in a state of waking. He was less gentle with her than her love was when he was in a state of dreaming. Poisons made a lover of him, but she wanted him to love her whilst he spoke to her with a lucid mind and eyes observing in cold determination. Ah, his obedient and disobedient states broke her heart always. And she closed her eyes, thinking of him, and what were dreams of women to the hearts of men? Lies they crafted and believed to be true. And transfixed she stood upon the threshold as shades fled, afraid of the spring bride's murder as it bled in another cheek, not knowing what to see. In the sky now. It was dark, and a chill hurtled towards her, her loose white kimono billowing, and blew loud against her breast. Her heart rung like temple bells, unafraid and fearful just the same. A moth had come to visit, and it sat silent and sinister on the lantern that hung by the door. She chose to ignore it and looked at the vastness that expanded in front of her lonely house. In her sight, everything appeared to come from the grey and black of night. The moors, as wind hissed clean through, swayed in waves, bowing in winds. Mist, scattering like cloven silk, formed again and again, desperate to gain shape, yet it was all for naught. Tonight, Storm's heart was set on coming, and it was coming harder and faster and fiercer from the sky. Her heart was too timid to match its passion, she lost before its mechanisms even began. Having grown tired of waiting, she sat down, a white camellia in her hand, and she thought of her temple duties. If he did not come tonight, she would go to the temple and pray and prostrate before Kami to make him come to her, see her, cherish her, love her. Oh, her heart, not eased of the thoughts, sang amidst ferocious songs of autumn's storms. Her tongue moved, too, and her tender breaths morphed into songs, and she was singing. Singing in night. Singing in love. Wind muffled her songs and ended her voice, but she squeezed shut her eyes against the wailing wind and pressed the camellia to her breast that trembled in prayer, and she pressed it harder and broke the stem upon which the flower stood robust. Oh, how she had ruined the flower, herself, in his love. And when she opened her eyes with hope in full bloom inside her heart, she saw a man approaching her home from the darkness of forest in unrest under the storm. She felt the moth's eyes on her back, watching, but she ignored it still, all fears of death in winter forgotten. She sprang to her feet and her hand dropped the flower. Then she grabbed the lantern that sat beside her and moved her slow thighs, and then her slow thighs got quick as she ran barefooted and disappeared into the dark green of wilderness, her kimono streaming, flowing, blowing like her wet and loose hair. So thoughtless that she did not even think of her other vision. In her mind, her heart, he stood in autumn's bloom, waiting for her in her heart, and she would love him in cold spring and warm autumn, her heart at his mercy always. White light split open, a maiden's musk-coated thighs, and swayed before her, unable to keep up with her muddy feet, and as she ran, night's colors merged and everything became one in her vision, a blur made from a singular color. Her heart beat faster, louder, harder as he drew near, and she, nearer, faster than he walked, she ran. It was always meant to be this way. And at last, she came to a halt, her smile coming and going away too soon. Light glowed over his face and brow and eyes and prominent freckles about his cheeks. It was Niji. She looked at him and then she looked down, blushing in embarrassment at the sight of her mud-clogged toes, her breast fast-moving and sweat-riddled, and as she stood still, colors separated and everything re-emerged as a separate entity, which possessed its own hues, in her eyes. "Hinata, it's cold," Niji said, always smiling. "Let's go inside. I've got good news for you." Yet her heart did not rise and feel joy at his words. Its speed had fallen, like her passion. The walk back home was quiet, the leaf trail quieter and unwelcoming without the warmth of his presence. A storm died in her breast, and she did not know when it would rise again without his touch. She was absolutely crestfallen, uncaring of the storm outside that shook this land. Quietly, Hinata washed her feet, quietly, she made tea for them both, quietly, she sat by the fireplace that she kept warm with fresh coals, every night. The house was a grave tonight, like always, and its cold moths feasted on her spirits till she would grow gloomy and sad and angry. Why did he not come? "The clan's transfer papers are coming from the capital," Niji said, but she did not answer, only nodded. "Suzuki-sama said that it'll soon be over. I just hope it'll be over for the better." And then he did not speak, and she did not speak, either. She had nothing to say. She wished him good fortune and better luck. He stopped and produced a scroll from his pocket. "I brought this letter from Hokage-sama. She assured me that Itaka-sama can't discharge you without her and Suzuki-sama's approval. You shouldn't worry anymore. Rest easy." He placed the scroll by her side and created the broadest smile she had ever seen on his face. It made him appear a little playful. Hinata smiled, too, a customary smile to return his. She did not look at the letter, not once, her eyes now focused on the flames as though they had stolen her heart and burnt it to ashes. "Why hasn't he replied?" she asked in a very low voice and advanced the cup to her mouth. Her heart was just not in this home tonight on autumn nights, it never was. "I can't say. He should have been back by now," he said, smile softening, eyes looking at the yellows and blacks that danced across her face. And then she said nothing, and then he said nothing, and then the devil said something lovingly to the lily and his storm, but neither heard and neither spoke any more. With his wings taken, the crow's journey was difficult through storms, but if home was where the heart was, his existed in a single entity. The rest of his heart, fragmented, existed in patches, buried in each grave, dead like the occupants. The patches stopped beating when theirs had stopped beating. Each lump knew their rhythms well. The house was quiet, a place of dim lights and old murmurs from empty rooms. His shadow stalked the walls like a ghost that came by from the graveyard, often. A welcoming coo, soothing and mild, issued from his chambers, and the peace of this heart that remained with him, resonated in love as though it was made to beat along with the child's heart, and without it, it would perish unloved and lonely. And the child was stormed tonight, weary of his lies. He was ready to come into the world of waking men, with eyes fire and firesome, a divine conception at autumn's peak, but this conception took place in winter's dream and winter's womb, and it was more divine than the last one, a new rebirth for this child that was his and his alone. The child opened his eyes, and there she sat by his side, his mother, a white haze, a beautiful apparition in the mist-woven room that was too dim and dark, and the child lifted his torso off the sweat-soaked covers that smelt of his musk and scent, arms outstretched, fingers trembling, water-starved lips shaking. Just to whisper in a tone loaded with love and longing he had not felt in so long, "Oh Oka-san. I've missed you." And a ferocious love that filled the child's eyes and dreams since their parting darkened his gaze, and his mother's countenance emerged from the patches of this world he had woken to, and she was beautiful. Very beautiful. Beautiful like the moon. Beautiful like the moth. Beautiful like the Lord. Beautiful like the devil. She was everything and nothing. Amen. 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 He just saw her lips, wearing the haze of a smile, permanent yet fleeting, kissed by spring in haste before she drew him into her breast, and he was too old to draw milk from her teat and fall asleep again, so he wept and clung to her in love. She kissed his brow and cheek and stroked his head and back. Every man was a child against a mother's breast. When she spoke from lips sweetened by winter's coming, her voice was rich and deep, not like a woman's. He looked up and his red eyes fixed on her long white throat, touched by her smooth hair, where a little shadow lay like a speck in the protrusion that moved there as she spoke, yet he loved her voice more now than he had loved her voice in the red of his memories, with a sort of love running through her heart that bled for his love still. She asked of him to go back to sleep before food was prepared. Yes, he was hungry. She knew. She always knew what he loved and liked and feared, like a mother would, like a mother should. Then she lowered him gently back on the bed, his eyes filling with new dreams that dripped from the overbrimming red in her eyes, and when she bent her head to kiss his brow again, he felt a musk of rains and moths in her hair. Such a lovely smell that assured him of her coming, and he felt content in sinking back into the ocean of her lies. And what were lies from a mother's lips? Stories, just stories, all children loved. The forest beckoned the new mother now, and its call was crushing. Her blood his blood ran and danced at the phantom image of that place in the forest that was blossoming in rich purple, so he left the sleeping child in a dream and walked with steps less steady and careful than before. The smell was faint and it played with his senses with a cruelty he always liked. And memories had come running back like children into the house of his mind. Past was never in the past. It was haunted like homes and tasted rotten and sweet like candies. "Itake, my boy, my sweet boy." She spoke. "You are a child, my child." He spoke. "Won't you come and kiss and smell and taste our love?" They spoke, but why did they matter? Why? He had piled the corpses from the gray of his threshold to the pink of the horizon. Oh, sweet pink, spring in winter's sky there, right there, bleeding its heart out in love. Oh, winter, sweet sweet winter, come here running for the heart that keeps. Oh, child, sweet sweet child, come here singing, see that for you it bleeds. What love in the white of winter, pink like spring, pink like blood. Sing autumn child, sing songs, sing. They grow fierce, forever smothered by your love. There was always a little wickedness in you, your heart, feet, your hands. A tongue that lied. A sly hand that broke heart's ties. The forgetful eyes that chose new things. The wicked boy. The wicked child. Your tongue was no less wicked, serpent-like, profane like the devil's. You wanted to know you did not want to know what lay in another's heart, such was the indecisiveness in your little heart, the abode of devil's love. Are you shy? Everything is gone, but the whimpers the child's throat has sealed away for you. Won't you listen, won't you see, won't you feel, the love autumn has nurtured in his heart? No, you shall bleed it on winter's ground, too, and put a new heart in its place that listens and sees and feels. Just you, only you. Amen. 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 The smell was strongest here, and his companions danced on devil's wings, awaiting his union with moon and moth in this night when autumn sang the loudest. The reaping had begun now, and winter unleashed its first whisper. Itaka stood by the spot where she had expelled the black curd, and he knew she wasted a part of him here. No matter, another time. Tonight he came to look upon the lilies and smell the moths that expelled poisonous fumes into the air whilst mating viciously. He looked at lilies, in autumn's bloom, dancing and catching the moon in their hearts. He had walked for an hour without a sense and sight, but now his eyes opened to colors. His lashes trembled faster than moth's wings, passion shaking loose and coming alive in his veins and loins like a wanton creature out for union, and he crumpled to his knees on the poison-soaked soil of autumn upon which pink moths writhed and wilted after mating in frenzy. A red one was dying, too, but its death was slower and sweeter than the pink one's. So foolish in lust, so hopeful in love. They jumped, pumped full with poisons filling their bodies as they awaited release. Perverse. Simple. Common. This ground was their lust's grave forever, always. He gazed up, purple spots appearing in his reds, and beneath the tree, a fine patchwork of moon's light and night was on his face. He leaned his head back and his spine and neck curved and his arms fell slackly to his sides, his hair hung loose and wet from his head as rain fell. His nostrils flapped and he sniffled like a child punished with severity. He had no space left in his senses to fill up with this smell. This was a holy perversion of his wishes, a wanton divinity. His hand brushed and pressed harder against his wanting organ that desired something tight and wet to let out the primal ooze, and his eyes opened wide and his mouth opened wider to issue sighs from a breast that rose and fell fast, and soon his breaths morphed into laughter, and he laughed and fell back against the tree, with one leg stretched out and one bent awkwardly. Every memory of his mother, father, child flowed in and flowed over the brink. There was nothing more to accumulate. He was full. He was about to take flight upon his faith with wings reborn and mighty. And he laughed and laughed as though everything was humorous tonight, his laughter crackling like thunder, soothing like breeze. He was not keen to run through the veins without purpose, and what was love till it did not but flow from the eyes? He closed his eyes, humored, still laughing. Chapter 72, The Child was Storm. Some men are boys at heart, companions in spirit. Boys played in spring and summer's warmth, yet autumn made them grow and winter kept them still and young. It was this lull, this stillness that never left the limbs of men. Some men, not all men, were prone to this strange habit, and when behaviors became habits, it was harder and harder to shake them off. This permanence haunted men to their graves. So at heart they remained boys, in spirit, men. Strange, what strange habits to seek and savor. They played games and their games were endearing, childlike, but deadly, tricky just the same. Their hearts had never known the sure touch of an adult's duplicity that was cruel, and you set children to catch children, men only punished them. And he loved the storm that was sated and quiet now, having spent its wrath inside the bedevilments of his dreams created for children. The storm was primal and in a state of infancy again. Soon, it would feed well upon the last harvests of autumn's life and make itself anew, drive itself to anger in a state of vengeance. Yet how would it feel to control it, direct his hand to its head and stroke it? He knew how to calm the child that was storm. It was hard to communicate his heart through the magnificent barrier of flesh and bone. The instrument thumped and spoke its language, yet his tongue was not always warm to its pleas. It stayed still the way he stayed calm, a secret shared between them. Winter did not always speak its heart, no, its mind and mechanism were more open to scrutiny, its spirit, naked and white, hidden underneath the pristine grave whose bits fell from the sky, it was a call to run and hide. It drew out children with promises of autumn's last remains that grew on trees bent and in forests crooked, but they got lost in mild mists and callous colds. Out in the wilderness they perished, with red and pink on their lips, lungs full of liquid blood, bones cold and brittle. Winter had many stories to tell, but children should fear it in their hearts and bones. They should fear it, always. In autumn's rains that fell like children's prayers, mothers died with swords in breasts, arms outstretched, defenseless. One touched winter upon its lips and brow. Death danced red and pretty in winter's countenance, a child's mockery, a child's gift, like a smudge against white. It was beautiful, most precious gift from nature. And winter's spirit was beleaguered by autumn's lush lashes, petal mouth, chaste mien. Ever since it was a babe whimpering in his arms, a mother's love was an expected condition, her child's beauty, a lasting malady. Its signs remained above its continuous graveyard, purple and pretty and with a heart so hard. Now, bodies of kin lay deep in soil, full of earth's creatures, eyes open and full of terror. Did they still see in the graves? Did they still feel in the dark? Did they still think in winter's graveyard? Strange, he did not ever want to see, hear, know of the reds and loves and pleas that parted from their bodies. Children ought to forget things that caused them worry. This child it would coo and it would gnaw, but his heart was set, desperate to avoid this inevitable spar, and it would grow deadly violent in winter's heart, a season of love's end and a new start. Lantern glowed on the low table, the color of which was soft red. Pink moved through wreaths that came from warm food and darted about, excited like insects forgotten in winter's air. Light grew, a budding flower, on the map of the boy's bony cheek he chose to see. It lacked radiance and ruddy red that complemented the plumpness it had in this youth's spring. This ailment had sucked the boy-child dry of his vigor, smile, and anger, his complexion, dull as flour, which possessed an elusive chalky hue, a feeble and etiolated color. The boy had not looked at him yet, his clumsy fingers busy with food, but his heart did not seem interested in feeding taste to his hungry tongue, and it had hungered and hardened in his mouth, deprived of the things all men cherished just to survive. Illusions made the heart happy, but they did not satisfy a man's primal drive. "Suzuki, you do not like the food?" he asked, almost bored of the hanging silence between them. Even men who conversed with silent brides grew bored sometimes and coveted the sounds of children's merry-making. The child woke up, but had his senses woken up, too? He would just have to find out. So he stroked the boy's head, sweetly, cautiously. He did not want to frighten him yet. The boy, Suzuki, did not answer. He fumbled with food, his fingers shaking, unable to steady the chopsticks as though he never practiced to hold them in his childhood. He was of half a mind to grasp Suzuki's fingers, which had gone pale as winter's fire, and help him, but the frown that grew between Suzuki's smooth eyebrows stopped him. He could tell that the boy's tongue was dripping with questions. "Where were you?" Suzuki asked in a manner as if he had not used his voice in so long, and cast his suspicious eyes about him, not casting them on his sibling. I read the letter." Suzuki cut him off, squared his shoulders, placed the chopsticks on the table. Green veins jumped and became prominent in his neck, portions of which were pink with blood, or, perhaps, it was the light streak. Itaka could not say. "It was from Tsunade," he said, and sniffed and strained his facial muscles as if he was still in pain. "You took a break? Where did you go?" And, this time, he looked at Itaka, and his face went beneath the light's threads that traveled across his features in sanguine movements. Suzuki had bathed. His face was sharp, clean, and alert. His hair, though still very wild, fine, and supple. His body smelt of a fragrance the servant must have added to warm water, sandalwood and something else. His father's eyes that slept in his face had not risen yet to match Itaka's arrogance, bespeaking calm. They hid away the undercurrent of fear and anger, but Itaka could see, he always could. "Village business," Itaka replied, and gazed upon the lantern. It was their father's, and it was old and frail now, its light, still magnificent, defying time, existing in hearts, yet it missed the mark on his Itaka's heart. It had missed it dearly. "Karen's gone." Suzuki stopped and titled his head and looked ahead at the shadows that materialized tenderly on the paper screen. "She'd never leave without telling me." Itaka felt resentment towards Kai. He had a small duty to fulfill, but he failed him again. He did not let anything manifest on his face and brushed away the forelock resting on Suzuki's forehead between his eyes. He could never understand how the child managed to function with such a disorderly appearance. All things considered, it matched his contempt for the norms and apt union Itaka could never reconcile with his brand of austerity. "Suijutsu, he's gone, too," Suzuki spoke again, and Itaka's own quietness made the situation more bothersome. "Where is he?" And Suzuki looked at his brother again, who possessed touches of their mother's tender countenance and marks of their father's firm one. His eyes hard, spilling over with accusation this time. The child had many questions to ask tonight. And Itaka smiled, slow eyes following the motion of the light as it moved like a red ooze along the white neck of the child, overwhelming the color of youth in his veins. He was angry, frustrated, weak. "Rest now," Itaka whispered, and took Suzuki's hand in his and brushed his thumb over the bony knuckles. "Look, how the fever has affected you. If you do not rest, I will not allow you to rejoin. Sleep now, and we will talk in the morning." Defiance lashed, unbound in the boy's blood and eyes. How long would the barricades hold? Truths were inevitable, and he would brave the storm that was this boy when the time arrived. He was fearless, heartless, soulless in his convictions that were as supreme as the sensation of being touched by the backhand of divine. Sasuke lowered his gaze, lashes bearing his father's light, and raised it back up again, and in his eyes, something had lost its bearing, and he questioned Itachi no more. She stood looking at the stalk that had risen above the soil that was wet and loose. The seedling fed upon rains and breathed in riches of this land, and for the first time in its life, it saw light come from autumn's sun. It was aloof, this sun, but not as distant and uncaring as winter's sun would be. Its light, soft as lilies, possessed a vague yellow hue that floated on the thicker air pervading in this season. It was tough to draw it in and relish the wonders of being alive. She frowned. Rao had planted a curse into the ground, and this garden turned gloomy at this accursed child's birth. The more it grew, the more lonely it made her feel, and it had only just begun its cooing, playing, scheming in winter's bosom. Soon, it would have winter's heart in its fist, make funny sounds from a throat untrained by years and duplicity. Then it would become the apple of his eye, only apple of his eye, and he would see nothing else, none but it. Its eyes would snare his gaze, its coos, his ears, its presence, his spirit, soul, and everything evermore. Oh, where was she in winter's heart? Nowhere, not even in the little corner by the graves. Curse this child. Curse this boy. Curse this storm. She wished she could have her beloved's heart, empty it out of all the things he cherished, and fill it up with her images as inducements for his passions, but it was not easy, it was never easy between them. That autumn evening when he had touched her with tenderness in the reclusive garden behind Kuro's house, there was bloom and passion in the sky, an intense shade of coming murders. Long, long ago this memory was tired from running on the roads of her thoughts. Yet, once upon a time, several moons passed, Winter was a lovely, lovely boy. He took care of the wild boy, Sasuke, and loved him so. She would come to him with letters in her hands that shook with the thoughts of his uncertain nature. She sat and watched as the little boy dragged his bag to him, took out his things, and played with them. Then Winter, her love and heart, Itachi, would take the boy into his lap and ask, eyes bent upon the little creature in reverence that wounded her soul, where did you hide the kunous? The mean little monster said nothing, he laughed and hid his face into Itachi's breast. Then he talked and Itachi only listened, and, outside, sky was changed by night's sake, a glass filled to the brim with promise of love eternal, but promises were only promises. Night was a liar, truth was not in its nature. The child grew sleepy, and night imitated him, to its hues diluted by more sinister combings that made it feel weary and tired of wearing many colors for show. Itachi lifted up the boy and pulled him to his breast and left the room, but he stopped at the library's door, his face cast in the red lantern's light, just for a moment to break her heart. I've got to put Sasuke to bed. Then I have to finish my reports. Give your parents my regards, I won't be able to meet with them. And then he left, without ever looking at the letters she had in her grasp. He pulled away from the room and light, and red lifted off his face as though a veil had been touched tenderly by evening's breeze. She looked up, pulling her eyes away from the shivering bud that was still frail and little. The sky was decorated in red and purple finery. It would be dark and night's arrival was imminent. The waxing moon would need more nights to locate its true strength and have intercourse with darker shades and conquer them, lay siege to their territory in arrogance and white armaments. It had been 2 days and 1 night since Sasuke woke up, and whilst Itachi called Rao back to the house, he did not bother to invite Izumi to his chamber, but he had shown her passion when Sasuke was still shivering in bed, bothered by pain and fever. It felt like a dream she dreamt in lust, during nights when storm raged and beat against the walls of her house in anger. What a dream that was her refuge, he, her solace, his flesh, her flesh's companion. She wanted to sense the frenzy of him inside her flesh, relish the taste of him on her tongue, enjoy the sight of him in her eyes. It was not fair to be wanting all the time, it was never fair. And she lowered her eyes, missing marks of affection and finding marks of envy, and gazed at the supple bud that would flourish well in winter. What if she were to trample it before it quenched its thirst from love's waters, bowered by winter's obsessions? Izumi! Came a voice from the window of the large house. Child, come inside. It is cold. Izumi spun around, garments floating, hair decorations clinking. Why yes, Rao-sama. She said loudly in reply, watching as Rao slid shut the window to keep the cold from getting inside. She did not look back at the bud and walked inside the house, her heart made. When Izumi stepped into the house, an emptiness greeted her. The rooms of his dead relatives were haunting. She would be lying if this house did not frighten her, it did. It was lonely like graveyards and silent like winter meadows where spring's shadows thrived, not the bright flowers that brought joy to hearts. She hated higanbanas that stood inviting like harlots on death's shores. Its beauty enraptured winter's sight and senses. She hated it. "Speak, child," Rao spoke and walked around the room with an incense container in hand. "You have been quiet since you came here. Did Itaka scold you? He can be very hard sometimes." "No." Izumi stopped and looked around at the little puffs of clouds that filled up the room. She pressed her sleeve to her nose. The smell was pleasant, but potent and overpowering. Rao chanted a song in a lilting, rough voice. Izumi had never heard it before. It was a song of autumn from the mountain nuns. It was sung to protect children against demons that roamed the dark, seeking wayward children to bewitch and murder. But was there a song to save demons from demons? She did not think such a song existed. Rao sat down by the fireplace that was hot and warm, huffing. She placed the container, which gave out indistinct puffs of smoke, down on the table. Lights traveled inside the deep lines of her face, and she appeared lovely in her own way when she smiled. She looked at Izumi, eyes shining as though they had stolen Light's character. She wanted Izumi to speak. Izumi worked her lungs and drew in the fragrant air to fill them to their depths. Her breast rose, and then she let out a loud and long sigh. Fire was warm on her face and bosom, parts of which turned light pink. "Itaka-sama doesn't lay with me anymore," she said, and saw Rao's smile lose its firmness. "If he doesn't he call me, how can I give him an heir?" Izumi looked at her with wide eyes, her cheeks carrying a distinct sheen of sweat. Yellow light illuminated the well-defined lines in Rao's face, lines that told her history. She did not speak for several heartbeats, a time and distance that tortured Izumi's heart, but she waited and hoped that this would make her compel Itaka to love her even if it was only her flesh. In time, he would care for this seedling, too. In time. "You are not his wife, child," Rao spoke, sighed, turned her face away. "I cannot force him to court you, and you cannot demand of him to care for you. A man makes or breaks a family, women only endure. So our laws make it so that a husband must fulfill his wife's needs. It is his duty. It is not about love, it is about the principle of things. What can I say to him about you? It is not that easy, my dear." Rao returned her gaze to Izumi, who had tiny yellow pearls in her eyes. "Do not grieve," Rao spoke and placed her old hand that was rough on hers. "I shall talk to him at night. Be patient. He is a good boy. He will listen to me, if not tonight, then tomorrow. For tomorrow brings hope, and we must never let go of hope." And this time, Rao's smile was loveliest, but wistful. At night, breeze was gentle and calm. This was a welcoming respite from the intermittent storm that lashed these lands with heartless vengeance. It would be back with words in its rain, passion in its thunder, punishment in its lightning that would make men's souls ring. She waited for its return and clash with winter's cold heart. She would watch it lose its intensity, and, perhaps, then it may dart. The willowy, beautiful boy of winter, whom she had rocked to sleep in her aged arms, was less aloof, less cold this evening. Dressed in traditional clothes, he sat by the low table and wrote, a thick brush coated with ink in his hand. The library was quiet, its walls lined with scrolls, antique frames, heavy cabinets, and more. Light from lanterns gleamed across this room's accessories, embedding itself in forgotten brush strokes, making them shine. The room seemed to come alive even in this winter boy's presence. "Have you forgotten about the heir business, child?" Rao asked and took a sip from the warm tea. "You run away from it the way thieves do from the ends of ropes." Itaka created the last letter and looked at her, the brush still clutched in his fingers with delicate practice. "Suzuki sleeps in my chamber, and I have no intention of entertaining her whims in his bed. Why do you suggest this? The thought is unthinkable." "The thought of you going near her in the guest rooms was just as unthinkable," Rao spoke sternly. Her calm temper was shaken. "But you did as you pleased, I did not stop you. I hoped that it would yield a result, but you withheld your chakra from her, robbing her womb of what it needed to flourish." He lifted and straightened his throat, letting it wear a more lively color for a change. Then he placed the brush into the ink bottle and directed all of his attention on her, but he said nothing. Itaka looked at her with eyes that gleamed with light. It was like a little smile in his smileless eyes. His face, framed by loose black hair, was lovely for her eyes, yellowed by brightness. Your behavior is unbecoming. You would be more interested in Izumi if you stopped enjoying yourself with that foul woman, that Teu. She spoke in a heavier tone, taking in a deep breath and letting it out quickly. Her eyes studied his, but when eyes smiled for too long, it was a show of insincerity. Would my behavior be less unbecoming if I treat her the way I treat a Teu? Though she would not enjoy honest intimacy, Itaka spoke, and he looked at her with sleepless eyes that never desired the comfort of sleep, and that made her worry. Rao put down the cup on the table with a harder hand, grabbed hold of his silky sleeve embroidered with purple lilies, and pushed it up. Her eyes gathered fury that had slept through the years, undisturbed. A purple vein throbbed pretty and distinct in his arm that was white as settled snow, begging to be noticed as though the rest had collapsed from overworking. You have been taking more of it again? Rao asked and pressed her fingers with a stern mind into his flesh, whirls of which were rough and deep like old soil. Why just to go beyond the shores of pleasure? To heighten your baser needs? You disappoint me, child. Then I shall be more considerate of this girl, ask of her to share my failings, Itaka whispered, and it made anger breathe fire into her body, and she struck him on the cheek once, twice, thrice with an open palm that was made harder and rougher with the deep passage of years till the little strength old age had missed faded from her arm. Rao pulled her hand back, breathing irritable, looking at the soft pink moving up into his cheek. The hue was reminiscent of the most fragile flower that grew at spring's end, but his face did not twist to show her any emotion. Shame on you! She hissed and clenched her fingers to stop herself from hitting him again. You went near her in that state when you knew better than to treat her like a common Teu. You broke that girl's heart when you never wanted her. Now that that state has passed, you are not interested in her anymore. Beastly vulgar. I did not expect this from you. Itaka looked back at her and spoke not a word. His countenance did not betray whatever scurried with poisons in his veins, and that engendered an indignation in her, and she left his room in anger. Night walked on through the shades, growing deeper and deeper into the unknown, but it did not stop to affect the light growing to bursting in her heart, eyes, and countenance. Izumi smiled, elated. She wore her best kimono, ruffed her lips, put up her hair in the most fashionable knot, the kind Teus favored. Rao promised her that Itaka would not send her away, not tonight. So she made her way to the largest guest room, heart flying through the sky. It was a girl's heart and it broke easy, it fixed itself just as easily, and she opened the door, and her smile brightened the still deep color in her lips at the sight of him. He sat on the futon, his expression not brightened by any smile, but when he looked at her, sitting inside the sober dimness of this room, she could not help herself from feeling loved. And Izumi did not see the ghosts of seasons and pasts in his eyes, so enamored by winter's child. There was a kind of desperate frenzy that danced in her flesh, and she wanted to control it, satisfy it, feed it. Only he could complete her, do away with the things that bothered her. And he would love her the way she loved him. He would. He could. He should. She closed the door behind her. The deep of the night's yearning was still few hours away. Chapter 73, Lost, Not Found. It was a day like any other day in this dreadful season that breathed winter's winds with increasing joy, chilly, gloomy, dreary. Everything smelt of lilies and rot, a devious love shared between autumn and winter. Animals lowered their heads and fed upon autumn's remnants. Spring no longer remained in this soil's memory, a forgotten trace, dead and buried in between wet layers. It was meant to be forgotten. It was quiet out here whilst she walked through the forest, homeward. Her bearing less calm, more anxious in morning's half-light, foreground against a sobering haze that bedecked willow trees. The forest slept through the dread of this season. Would it smile in winter? She could not say. Flowers of spring at her feet had long since wilted their brittle stems that remained above ground, decorated with shells of dead pink moths, cracked and crackled like morning biscuits made from old grains. To her dismay, she caught sight of purple lilies hiding in shadows like scheming children. They shook gleefully against an air current she could barely feel on her eyes and cheeks. Her face fell, and she looked at a pink moth that still struggled with sensations of pleasure and death in its belly, its flesh eaten hollow by a distinctly purple poison. She bent down, took it into her hands, watched it struggle in great pain. It had laid its eggs somewhere amongst the thousands that clung, white, round, pearly, to the underside of leaves. Was it worth it? She wanted to ask, but what would the moth born without speech tell her? Nothing. When she was 17 years of age, she was a budding woman going through the motions of metamorphosis. She had started bleeding from her still ripening genitals few years ago, which produced a sharp odor, which had yet to ripen like spring's fruits and expel something sweeter. She hated the blood when it came messy and smelly and red. It soaked the rags clean through, spread out and dried up like loose jam over the swell of her thighs, when she was not careful, and made her belly ache during the days she did not eat well. Her mother was happy. She even smiled that her daughter had gone through this bloody rite of passage. She did not understand her. Her daughter was half a woman now, however. Books on anatomy and workings of sex fascinated her just the same. Still young and still foolish, she expected all boys to flock to her. She read that the smell of female sex, the one that was trapped underneath the neat enclosure of nether lips, was especially appealing to young males. It made little sense for some men to reject her and some to want to court her. This paradox of men's hearts and loins and noses puzzled her. When she first met Suzuki, he was 13 years of age, and she, 17. In her, nerve-fraying desperation and underlying frenzy grew, one she had never experienced before. At the sight of him, he was the most beautiful and wild boy, with eyes like the blackest stones, with tongue like the sharpest kunus. He cared not whose heart he broke and wounded. He spoke of what was in his mind. He was honest. He was kind and unkind, strangest, littlest boy. The older one lured flesh with his flesh, the younger one repelled flesh with his boyhood. There was a seizing charm that haunted about the older one, and though more beautiful than the wicked one, the little one was too pure to enchant man. He was innocent, not yet ripe. The rhapsody of his flesh, which was caught in music of youth for the cunning one, she found it wanting. His accent, still not honed and matured, shifted innocently between formal and informal, and something else she could not place. He was keen on impressing the older one whenever he was around. He would stand in his shadow, face lifted and eyes spirited, and speak, speak, speak. He would even smile. Then oddest, sweetest boy. He was young, but not young enough that would entail abstention from intercourse with ripe girls and women, boys and men, too. Oh, her heart and mind, which followed her flesh's dictations, worked humorlessly to coax him into intimacy. Even at that age, he was a bit taller than she, with legs and arms robust. And as fair and lovely as he appeared, he hid away his intemperate nature in the close disguise of his innocence and boyhood. He possessed quite the temper. Noises from nature jumbled up and sexual tumult ruled her flesh. She had always known that, if she did not act, it might eventuate in a harmful behavior, so whilst they stood alone and together in Spring's forest, which stayed in a state of waking, his temper lashed her senses when she reached down and touched his genitals through the material of his chinin pants. A frown changed his face that grew less kind in appearance in spite of Spring's tender lights that floated alongside his face and near transparent mists, and then he rejected her in a tone of anger overflowing. Just like that. She asked why, but he spoke not a word to calm her anxiousness. Then he walked away and left a silent girl behind in Spring's fleeing noise, and as he matured, he grew more and more distant from her. She tried and tried, yet there was no rewriting the inscriptions on his heart, well and meticulously constructed in matters which concerned her. And other things. He never requited her lust. He was most gifted, and she always felt that his duties did not do justice to his outsized talents, but what good were his mind and body to her when his heart did not inspire any lust in him for her and her flesh? And, yes, boys, men, too, came to lay with her, asked of her to spread her thighs wide to accommodate their lengthening organs, yet he never did. To him, she was invisible, to her, he was visible. What a lovely boy, hurtful and cold to her. When the wriggling stopped, so did the memories struggle. Gently, she placed the moth down amongst many free ones that lay dead and soaked over the ground. It was drizzling again. Then she made her way to her home. Trees stood jutting in her path, but she knew her way back, like always. She had just stepped onto the man-made stone street when a voice called to her, "Sakura-san." Sakura turned around, it was Ryo. He came to her with an ungainly walk, hair all sprung and prickly. He was clumsy, she thought, but she managed a smile. He had a scroll in his right hand, the ends of it appeared blotchy black with rain. It's from Serizawa-san. Sasuke-sama might resume his duties today with Kai-san. He wants a full report about the medical supplies that were used in the captain's absence, he said, held out the scroll, and flashed a cutthroat, dazzling smile. He had a perfect set of teeth. Sakura nodded and took the scroll. She did not stick around, for the drizzle turned colder and heavier. She truly hated autumn. So she turned away from him, quietly, and made her way home, eyes bent on countless ripples appearing in the film of water which persisted over the pathway. She did not hear the slosh-slosh of her sandals. The walk back home was a lonely one. The streets were empty, 'twas a ghost town with stray voices that came from homes and shops. Lights blinked on closed doors, their hues smothered by mists and rains. How could one's spirits stay jovial in enduring gloom? Purple lilies, such children, were cruel. Yet she had to meet with him and take from him a promised cure. It was all for naught. Her father was still dying piece by piece from an ailment that was incurable. When she was young, he sold wares in treacherous lands, a peddler of common things. He was not respected amongst the people of shadow villages. The girl-child Sakura wanted to be a merchant like he, but as she grew up, she felt the scorn of men hit her harder than it had her father. Sour-faced and high-strung, she turned her back to the craft. Her father was disappointed in her, but differences made men turn devils against you. It was no use. She chose the path of a shinobi, a life in which blood and creed mattered less. You brought back a pound of flesh from the enemy, and every man cheered. At dawn, you would fear nothing. At night, you would lay down to sleep in a fetal position and coo in fear of your victim's vengeance. Yet it was primal, everything was raw and real. Dirt under the fingernails of a common merchant was vile, blood-soaked fingers of a dutiful shinobi, a measured mile. How things changed, how they remained the same. She grew up hating her merchant father, and upon her hung a mist of otherness she never could escape. In Naruto, she found peace of mind. In Sasuke, she sought peace of body, with exceeding desperation, and when the body was not at ease, the mind became a playground of dangerous riots that had a tendency to stray, and she had strayed so far down the roads that lead to dreams of little girls, princes. Escapes festooned with little thoughts littlest girls cherished. And 3 years ago, he went away to sell medicines in a secluded village and contracted a fungal infection from a rare black pin mold, one that festered between the dark seams of wet stones that endured years of dormancy to cause men nightmares and suffering. He got lost in rain and storm, but winter's snow, with divinity in its unblemished state, that shone on peaks caught his eyes. Bewitched by its enduring beauty, he wandered deeper into trouble. He was never the same again. Now, empty bottles of laudanum lay shining and scattered in the changing lights by his bed. In pain, he cried out obscenities. In anxiety, he coughed out blood that dirted his clothes and sheets. Insolvent and irritable man, circumscribed by dreams that lay in ruin. Hours of the day, days of the week, weeks of the month, months of the years locked together and blurred into spotty inscriptions on her dear diary scrolls, but her wishes that stayed smooth and regular like dreams suddenly became unattainable. Will it be worth it? She thought, but like the unspeaking moth, she had no answer. Outside the window, sky turned red and dark, a wraparound of reds and purples for autumn's sky, a kingly garb for a king she always desired. Yet he was never hers, never. He was never fair, never. Air, cool like rain, filled Sakura's lungs up, and she placed the scroll on the table. It was time to meet up with the man in shadows again. He asked so much and gave so little. It was not as though he could give her what she wanted, but, at least, she found a purpose in him, a purpose to go on, a purpose to live. With this last thought, she wounded her thumb between her teeth and felt the metallic spurt of bitterness tingle her tongue. Then she drew a quick symbol on the floor and made fast seals with her fingers, and in the blink of an eye, Ryo felt her vanish in her room without a trace. When she appeared at the hideout, it was darker and sparsely lit than usual, but something was different this time. From crevices in old walls, purple lilies grew, shirred by darkness and lichen, delicately. Their fragrance excited blood and bud, their presence roused lust and dust. Sweat materialized on her forehead, a cluster of droplets on her chin. Bright chakra breaths crossed amidst flora like prayer beads, and at the hot sensations they stirred in air. Blood gurgled from the broken orifice between her thighs and soaked through her underwear to make a dark stain, and with it came the tiniest drop of black substance she had nurtured in her womb whilst dreaming of the older one. It hid well inside Red and fell down into the crack that was an unending gorge for its tiny size. It had found the right home to grow at last. She heard footsteps approach her and turned around, and, in a moment, a young man walked into the corridor and the wash of light that was dim. His face was meek, but she knew Danzo never kept the company of meek men. She had never seen him before. He looked at her and produced a scroll from his pocket, so Danzo did not want to see her this evening. Take it. A guard from Mist brought it. It's got another kinjutsu, he said, his tone guarded, and held out the scroll. May will bring another one when she comes to Konoha. When? She asked and took the scroll from him. Soon, he gave a curt reply, face full of shadows, and she felt that the conversation was over. You're bleeding, he suddenly said, looking down in curiosity at the red globules slithering down her left thigh. They itched, passing down over her skin, exciting fine vellus hairs as they went. I noticed, she said, but, when she turned around to go for the receiving seal etched deep and black into the solid floor, he spoke again, keep an eye on that Hyuga girl. Hinata? Why? She stopped and asked, shocked. Danzo-sama's orders. He thinks that Itachi knows everything about you. It's for the best that you're careful, he said, his words dripping with latent threat this time. Distracted, he turned and tapped his finger thrice against the withered lantern fixed to the wall with visible screws. This dislodged a chunk of muck stuck to the inside of the glass and brightened the light beam, in which the droplets appeared thick and shiny against her flesh's blushing pink. Then he stepped back, as if to give her room to recollect her breaths, and walked away, a lasting echo of his steps filling the tight corridor. She thought it wise to keep Itachi's forays into her mind a secret. As always, Danzo posed more questions and provided no answers, asked more and gave little in return. The air sung a refrain, but she had no words to answer it. She heard it one last time, talking to her heart, and disappeared from the corridor inside a bright light. When Izumi woke up in the morning, she saw red moths dead in the large garden tree, saw them hanging from boughs like blood torrents frozen, but when the boughs shook to cold, they, like leaves which remained, fell down on the sodden ground bursting with smells. Had the red moths come to gaze upon the beloved in envy? How terrible! Now, their bodies lay scattered on the ground, interspersed by water-filled shallow rills in the soil. The bud had grown some more, encouraged by the season that allowed it to soak up its richness. At this rate, it would sprout a flower soon. Oh, it was most concerning. What would she do? The wild little boy stole her letters in the past, often, yet one night, bursting with anger, she gave chase to him through rolling mists and wet flora, and when she caught up as he stopped by the pond, smiling at what he had done, she grabbed him by the wrist, swung him around, and struck him across the cheek. The quick clap-like sound echoed, as if a wet and slippery pebble collided against pebble. The plump cheek rippled with the force of her aggression, and red darted across white with quickness. Most children would have wept, but Sasuke was not most children. He stared at her with fire in his eyes and right cheek. Rain and mist did not cool that shade, and she found herself getting afraid at the sight of Itachi whilst he walked to her with quick steps, his Sharingan growing in anger inside narrow shadows. Itachi went down on one knee and touched the soft cheek that burnt. Sasuke did not say a word, his eyes fixed on her with a determination she did not expect from a child of 6. Tears were in his eyes and on his cheeks, spread around like pond bubbles which reflected light. She could tell that they did not materialize from weakness, but from anger. Why did you hit him? He's just a boy. Itachi spoke in a deeper voice not controlled by his patience and rose to his feet. His Sharingan had not returned to a state of rest. Izumi stopped, her heart racing in madness. What had she done? Izumi's eyes widened and then she squeezed them shut and pressed her hands to her breast when she saw Itachi raise his hand to hit her, too. She sniffled, shaking in fear to brace his strike, cracked her eyes open, peered at him. He had lowered his hand that rested on Sasuke's head now. Itachi-san, I'm sorry, please. Get out of here. I don't want to see you again. He spoke in a tone that was calmer than the previous one and lifted up Sasuke into his arms. Then he walked away back into the shadows that came from about the house. Itaka-san. She wept, looked down and then up at the sky where meek red danced, a rich palette awaiting the rage of coming murders. That was so long ago, before the murders, before the indifference, before the distance. Now, her eyes focused on the ornate wall-mounted rack, off which light glanced. The door to the evergreen garden lay open, letting in lights that powered through wet foliage. Sounds of rain that struck lightly this house filled the room up to the ceiling. It was always raining these days. She gazed upon the visible bend of stream by the stone lantern. The stream had slightly overflowed its pebbled bank, its speed retarded, and water sought new channels through rills. That portion of garden was muddy. Izumi saw hazes of red and white and black and purple koi twisting and glancing under numerous ripples, their heads bent to the stream's bed. They liked to stay here rather than swim out with the gentle flow. Suzuki fed them well. She sighed. Itaka was quiet, too quiet, whilst he sat by her side, busy writing something. Izumi had not expected that he become jovial over the prospects of sake and mating, yet his distant nature hurt her heart. When Itaka was a boy, he always left her in awe. It shocked her that so wise a perspective would come from so young a boy. The words from a boy that always delighted the girl, hurt the woman. There was a fear of his desertion that supplied her with nightmares. He was not the one to ply lovers with jewelry and affection, but she could not imagine why anyone would take instant flight after getting better acquainted with this side of him. One woman before her did, a hopeful bride-to-be like she, brought to his chamber by his insistent grandmother. She stayed for 2 days and 2 nights and fled his house, thinking him to be a corpse with no heart. Izumi could not imagine why. She placed her hand gently on his working arm and leaned her head against his shoulder. He stopped in his task of writing for a beat, an agonizing fraction too long. Then he resumed without looking at Rao, who was smiling from across the small table between them, pulling her gray-colored hair from her face, her old eyes squinting. Izumi smiled. She had dreamt of him for so long, settling and sliding between her legs, moving and delighting her flesh. Izumi did not understand why she took to her heels, but she heard from a trusted friend that the woman liked the younger brother more. How foolish! He brought great delight to her senses in dying hours. He was a good lover. He did what she asked and touched her where she liked it most, with a face void of passion, with a steeliness to his tone. She did not care. Izumi laid down to sleep and mate with him, and creatures made music in the light and night. He liked to keep the garden door open during night, but she never felt winter's ghost, glimmering in patches inside, mists spreading in curls about ground, and she clutched to him and sighed to him in lust. She enjoyed initiating the act, making him join his flesh to her flesh. Girl, she was such a girl with the most girlish heart. Often, he would lie on his back, hand on his breast, head and neck straight, and look up at the ceiling where reflected ripples rippled silver. Lost and unblinking, he stared, like nothing existed in the world but the faces of moon in all manner of things, and she was forgotten in the moments. Just like that. And he was very beautiful that she would look upon the moon over his throat that peeked from between the hair so black. She was not allowed to press her body to him like a needy child after the act was done. He liked to maintain distance even from the lovers he indulged. So days crossed and nights passed, and she waited for a sign of him to appear in her womb. Sooner or later, it would, and that made her quite happy. Izumi was thinking of speaking with him about the growing flower in the garden when the door opened and Suzuki walked in. Itaka stopped writing and looked up with hardness withering in his eyes. She looked at Suzuki, too, whilst he stood in the light that turned bright in dissipating mist. He looked unreal, his beauty unnatural. She never understood the women who desired the company of this man who approximated an ethereal boy in his adolescent years. The rain stopped. I need to speak with you about the team, Suzuki said, his eyes wandering about the room. Itaka nodded once and frowned a subtle frown when Izumi did not move. Suzuki bent his head and let slip a little chuckle. Izumi, come. Rao spoke as though she was speaking to a wee girl, nodding. At that, Izumi frowned, a frown that was exquisitely comical in appearance. She got to her feet, did a little bow to Itaka, and marched behind Rao, but not before sticking her tongue out at Suzuki whilst she passed through the door, a gesture that did not go unwitnessed by Itaka. What is it? Itaka asked and rubbed at his temple with the tip of his fingers. The team, where is it? Sasuke asked, and Itachi saw the same accusing boy glaring at him from his face. I discharged them, he spoke simply and resumed writing. Why? He asked, his tone impatient as always. Your team's incompetence nearly cost you your life. He paused and dipped the pen into the inkpot. It is for the best. You can't discharge them without my. I can, and I did. Itachi cut across him and stopped writing again. It is in my authority to extend their stay. I decided against it. Suijutsu will come by to collect his resignation from the outpost. You can meet with him should you desire. What incompetence! You don't tell me anything and keep doing things as you please. Sasuke pressed on, and his voice cracked with irritation a bit. I do not wish to speak of it. That is all, Itachi spoke, and this time, he chose not to stop his writing and look at his younger sibling. He heard Sasuke breathe out a loud breath of frustration, but he said nothing. It was for the best. Itachi was silent. Sasuke, annoyed by the scribbling noises that came from the pen scraping against the scroll. Itachi was ignoring him again, and he disliked that his brother had created his own scriptorium in the library to keep on acting in this manner. Sasuke, determined to wheedle a tiny hint out of his brother, opened his mouth to argue when Kai came into the room through the garden. At his back, light shone brightly that he looked like a lump of coal to Sasuke's eyes. Kai bowed his head and did not raise it. Always a sycophant, Sasuke truly loathed him. Till you are not strong and robust, Kai will oversee the matters of your team alongside you, Itachi spoke, and this revelation struck Sasuke's senses and made him angry. I don't need him, he said, almost whispering, almost hissing. Itachi stopped writing. He put the pen down, gazed at the scroll, and stood up. He wore white garments with a black haori. Sasuke could not tell where his hairs, which fell upon his shoulders, began and ended. He walked through lights to Sasuke, breaking them in half, and stopped a step short of him. Be a good child. Do not disobey me, Itachi spoke and adjusted Sasuke's flak jacket. Look, how your hairs have grown. They grow out so fast. Cut them. He nodded with a little tilt of his head and smiled an unnatural smile that was soft and cold at the same time. Oh, I received the delightful letter from the Hyuga. Persistent girl, Itachi spoke and pressed Sasuke's rough hair down. You clever child. It appears that I made a little error in judgment. I cannot discharge her without a reason. And I searched hard in my memories and found an answer. If she has not learned anything of value in the coming trials, I will discharge her. You may leave. Itachi gently tapped his fingers against Sasuke's cheek, twice. The older one could see the helplessness, the annoyance, the anger sprout like clustering blooms in the younger one's eyes, yet the younger one said nothing and left the room in silence. When Itachi heard Sasuke leave the house, he turned around and looked at Kai. He had not lifted his face since he entered this room. You could not hide one missive in my absence. Is watching over a little boy so hard? What am I to do with you? He spoke, his smile lost to cool arrogance and cooler anger. Forgive me, Itachi-sama. He stopped, speaking in intermittent whispers. I left to tend to my sister, Kuro. She called me to her. She had a fever. She gets ill when seasons change. Leave. I will speak with you later, he commanded and watched Kai leave the same way he came in. His weakest shadow slipped away behind him. A few moments passed and Rao came back into the room, and Itachi could tell that she was not happy with his treatment of his bride-to-be. He helped her sit down by the low table and spoke, You should rest. This exertion is not good for your health. You do not care, child, she spoke and wiped away wispy silver strands from her cheek. Show the poor girl a little warmth. She is heartbroken by your distance. Itachi sat down, too, and gazed at her and spoke, What more do you want me to do? Dandle her in my lap when she weeps? Put morals of food in her mouth to satisfy her whimsy? Write love letters to her whilst it rains? If that were your vision, then, perhaps, Sarizawa was better suited for her. Though I imagine you will have to press him with conviction to take another wife, or relinquish the one he has amidst great sorrow and tears. He is quite the romantic, or duty-bound. I have always misjudged his intentions regarding the most delicate matters of marriage. The man is very strange. Upon hearing the frustrations of his typically cold grandson so apparent in his words, Rao pressed her hand to her lips and laughed. Wind swung the window open and it hit against the wall. Wind and rain came at his face. He was too tired to close the window. He liked the cold, it calmed the heats in his heart that raged in this unfamiliar age. Perhaps his heart had escaped the time of withering, staying young like he. His fever is down. He is sleeping, Kushina spoke, her fairy-like face glowing in the lantern that refused to go out. Minato smiled and Kushina elegantly interlaced her arm with his. I do not understand, the seals are not working, she spoke in her usual delicate voice whilst she looked out into the dark of the forest that fringed the peaks. Perhaps Suzuki is responsible. Sharinon can manipulate the essence of the maturing seal like Fugaku did with the host. It bypasses it. I do not know how why. It is a mystery to me. I was cut off from the Tulip Squad when the host went disgraced. Danzo's orders, Minato spoke and issued a long white sigh that vanished into the breeze. I believed that implicating Fugaku would grant me the seat after his shame grant me the power to resist Danzo when he suggested that I place the essence in my son. I was wrong. Minato. Kushina whispered with trembling lips and squeezed his hand in hers. It is not your fault. Darling, forgive yourself. I never offered any aid regarding the coup. Perhaps this is karma. He spoke, and she saw pearls floating over the oceans of his eyes, blue, ever blue. Do not fault yourself. She assured and planted a kiss on his hand. I have placed a good seal on Naruto, one that will mature quickly through the cold days of autumn. The season favors this seal. He will recover fast. Did he send the Renjo to Hayashi's house? Minato asked and looked at her. Kushina nodded. Some hours ago, she whispered, a sense of relief in her voice. We never should have burdened him with this matter. Regardless, it is in the past, he spoke, looking at the droplets crossing and flying across the window frame, silver and delicate in the light. They were many. He wants to rejoin the squad. Should I? She asked, unsure. Let him. It will make him happy, he answered, and his overcoat floated in the breeze. Its colors, fires which marked the edges with surety, had truly faded. Wind, unable to carry their whispers so far, reached Hinata with a gentleness. She sat by the lantern, its light passing through camellia's delicate white petals, which like silk were the finest and whitest. The purple lily had dried up by its side, and with its splendor lost, chakra breaths stopped coming, vanished. She did not understand their mechanics. Her father's house creaked less tonight. Perhaps the storm was calmer now. She moved the flowers aside and opened the first letter. The handwriting was made of erratic lines in spots of black ink. Naruto never had a steady hand. Dear Hinata. I'm sorry, I'm truly sorry. I never knew you, and you never knew me. I can't return the years I've taken from you, but with this, I hope that you find freedom in the new years you always wished for. You are free. Find it in your heart to forgive me. Your dearest friend. Naruto. Hinata's lips and fingers trembled, and the letter slipped from her hands. Hastily, she opened the other one. This was composed with a steady mind and bold hand, the lines having a sense of less impulse and more clarity. Minato wrote this, she could tell, and true to his promise, Naruto had freed her from their agonizing union with 3.5 vertical lines and a clear black thumbprint. She whimpered, like a girl child who tried hard to hide her weakness, breaths hissing from her bloodless lips in spurts. Frightened of the words as if they had come alive to bite her, she took hold of camellia's stem and ran out into the rain. It hit her flesh with a ferocious cry, roaring, excited from slumber, her spirit, soaring. Hinata did not care where she ran, heartward. Rain and wind struck her cheeks with passion, her wet hair and kimono slapped against her flesh, and she dripped, dripped, dripped. Her feet, rough white and hard from years of toiling amidst the grass of moors, sank into the loose mud. She did not care. There was a strange sense of freedom in running. At last, out of breaths, she sank down by a stone lantern. Fast droplets slipped off its edges like unbreakable and unending strings. She leaned over the stream, her hand in mud, her other hand holding the camellia tight and hard. And she saw blood pool into her lips whilst she created a trembling smile, and she laughed for she felt happy. Free. She said, elated without measure. Free. Oh Oka-san, I'm free. Hinata jumped to her feet and spun round and round and round in dizzying circles. The whole world and its hues crushed together to make of this woman a happy little girl. Round and round and round she kept spinning, releasing silver droplets in floating circles with her movements, thinking herself to be a stringless toy. It was Naruto's birth date today, and a gift of freedom for him was truly an act of freedom for her. She loved Autumn, she loved him, missed him, wanted him, and she stopped, leaned her head back, and passed her hands over her hair and head and heart, sensed his songs rattle her spirit, felt his instruments kiss her flesh, heard his whispers in her head. She opened and closed her eyes, blinking. Free. 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 Itachi was mean and imposing. He did not understand his older brother not one bit. With Kai around, his movement was restricted. What to do, what to do? Time and men were not on his side, it was like the whole damned world was out to get him, ruin him. He would not sit easy. Damn his brother, he was hiding something, and he intended to find out. The emissaries from Cloud and Mist were coming soon. He had to create a chance to slip out. It was now or never. He smiled and opened the little safe place only he and Karen knew of. His Sherry-nan saw the surprise before he removed the seal-covered wooden piece in the floor of his room. It was a missive, and its content it surprised him. It said that Itachi asked of her to make a seal for him, a seal from the base seal utilized for Biju sealing. His smile widened and he let out an innocent laugh. Could it be? He thought, but it was just a little game between hard-headed and unbending brothers now, was it not? Let some fools die, let some fools cry. The thing was lost, not found, but soon. Oh, his brother would be very sorry. Chapter 74, A Temple of Night's Lamentations. Sky, a temple of night's lamentations, yellow took from it its radiance, and dawn became dusk and dusk, dawn when liquid light surged back out. Eternal was this playtime of children, thunder, and clangor, but this morning's breast was torn and turning red at night, hot like May's sun, a child raging between streaks of gray, autumn's darling parted from the other in anger. Rain's autumn rains never did relent. Today was another somber morning, a slow rain fell, and translucent droplets, disturbed dearly by lights which came to the ground as though by force of will, impacted onto the forest, deformed, burst into fast droplets, glinting. The ground was soggy and sucked in his sandals, groves fed by water. This forest's death was slow, so slow, and agonizing, but autumn's slow death was the sweetest. In winter's eyes and embrace children, such martyrs. Sasuke had no intention of coming out here, walking in the rain to do nothing. It was a hopeless mission that served no purpose. He always could count on his dearest brother to humiliate him, remind him of his place in the clan. He let out a hot breath touched by his chakra, and fog melted rapidly in front of his eyes, decorated by rain-touched lashes. Anger moved and struck the chakra coil, and inside, chakra crackled and anger did boil. His sibling, Winter's immaculate dream, was never fair, he was unfair, always. Sasuke walked through the sleeping forest made restless by benign and angry storms. He could hear Kai's wet footfalls behind his back, in pursuit of him, and he had the sudden urge to stop, turn around, and take his anger out on him. He wanted to be unfair, too. Itachi's most obedient whelp, the man was insufferable. Sasuke chose not to turn around and remind Kai of his hopeless cravings. What good would it do? He let out another breath and fog sizzled and fumed against the latent fires. His mind left the vacancy of his gaze and entered the domain of desperation. Karen had asked of him to meet her in their secret place his brother did not know of, a secret between children. But how? He did not know what to do. Something had to give. But what? Think, he thought, rubbing his fingers together inside the pocket. He walked and walked, eastbound, and in his sight, rain and fog animated the trees that stood still. At last, he reached the clearing, a patch covered with layers upon layers of forgotten leaves. The aroma of musk and rot nearly clogged up his throat and nostrils, but there was a flavor of autumn in the air, a taste of flowers. The smell was soothing to his senses. Sasuke stood with his back against the tree whilst fog gathered about his ankles like a turbid river's froth. Kai chose to stand beside him. He did not enjoy this close proximity to Kai, but to keep his brother satisfied, he endured his presence. He watched Niji, red in the cheeks with cold, as he collected the small missions reports from Ryo, Sakura, and Tuchinins. They had to investigate the case of an ill guard in one of the outposts. If his suspicions were accurate, it was just common cold. Sakura looked at him once, her movements twitchy, and then she bent her head to avoid looking at him in the face. In the fog that rose, she was a haze of lines and colors. His sherry nons were frigid to her pleas and seductions. He never could understand her passions, her constant lust struck his nerves with an irritation. The missive could not come sooner and then she would be gone. Naruto ought to understand, it was no use playing husband with her, marriage was not a lovesick children's game at the House of Dolls. He was a fool. She moved through the contours, a distant mirage, stopped by the tree to look back at him once more, and turned away and disappeared little by little in the intensifying autumn's effects. He never possessed the heart to miss her presence, to feel her absence. Soon, there would be a sense of permanence to her absence. He could not say. He felt anything, not even a little tingle, at the prospect. Moments passed and the mission team went away into the forest, all but Niji. He shoved the scrolls he could into his pockets and clutched two in his hands. Then he made his way to Suzuki, his steps less firm on the rain-covered ground, from which autumn flowers grew. Little bursts of colors, they whipped about at his motion. "Suzuki-sama, Niji said and stopped to hold out a scroll, I didn't expect to see you so soon." "What does the report say?" Suzuki asked, unable to restrain his irritation any longer, which revealed itself in form of a throbbing green vein in his temple. It. Niji said, voice trailing off into the morning gloom. "'Twas just common cold. Nothing serious. It's all in this report Sakura made." His breath hissed in sharply between his teeth, and the pink of his cheeks turned red. He was embarrassed. Suzuki took the scroll from Niji's hand and nodded. Niji gave a short bow and left, and he was done with this mission, at last. Of all the missions to have him oversee, this was what his over-efficient brother chose. Anger, he felt such anger. A trace of it materialized and drowned in his eyes red and visible whites of his neck and countenance, invading the chalky hue like a blood spill into the snow, a little pink, a little sweet. This was too much. He would speak to his brother, and he would have to listen. With this thought, which starved for the fulfilling meal of confrontation, Suzuki walked away from the clearing, homeward. His steps were firm and quick, his heart, raw beating, and fast-sounding. Suzuki did not stop, and seeing his conviction so stark and apparent on his physiognomy, Kai followed in his wake. "Suzuki, slow down," Kai said from behind, trying to catch up, puffs of white coming from his mouth and nostrils. Trees' limbs moved in wind and play about them, but Suzuki did not answer as he moved like a wrathful ghost in their midst. If he made it to the house, Itaka would be angry with Kai again, and he could bear his increasing anger no more, not when it showed little signs of gentling. "Suzuki, wait." He called out again, breathless, and he increased the speed of his walk and stretched out his arm to get hold of Suzuki's wrist. "What?" Suzuki stopped and turned around to face him, his Sharingan's flower out this time to threaten him to mind his manner and space. Suzuki never enjoyed his company, Kai knew. The feeling, at least, was mutual. "Itaka-sama," he stopped to calm his fast breathing, "Itaka-sama's instructed me to. I don't care what he's told you." "I don't give a damn," he said and looked down, his eyebrows coming together, his cold bitten lips narrowing into a hard line. "Let go." He looked back up at Kai, and a sharp light rolled over the fire of his irises. Kai, as if burned by his gaze, let go immediately. Kai stepped back. This was not good. "No need for anger, Suzuki, I'm just doing my duty." "Sure you are," Suzuki answered, and a smile decorated the dull hue of his lips with a livelier red, his anger vanishing like mist. Oh, and it was telling of Kai's weakness. He loathed this younger one. In the rain that thinned and the light that thickened in glorious, vision-defying waves, Suzuki saw a mousy man that bothered him night and day. His brother's favored instrument had mostly kept his virtue over the years. Like a kami-fearing and karma-loving dervish, Kai was not beastly as much as timid in manner. His face was that of a young man's, albeit he was as old as Serizawa. He was easily intimidated, and at his height, Suzuki could look at him eye to eye. Kai's face was sharp like river stones and thin like a wooden puppet's and white like the whitest bone, but less white than his brother's. His eyes, unnaturally bright and dull in equal measures, failed to offer decorative effects for his features, half of which remained hidden by shadows on sunken flesh and wild black hair about his brow and cheeks. He spoke in a clipped cadence that gave his words the illusion of competence and possessed a mean mouth that he kept pursed tightly over his teeth. A method which created the impression of a strong visage. He invested great care in creating a fair appearance to entice the one he wanted to entice desperately, and for what? His face had no feature with which his character could flourish in another's eye. He was as dull as the Lord, whom he served, was magnificent. How foolish! Kai was a tick engorged on his blood in his eyes, no more, no less. Through his lens, Suzuki saw a wanting man who wore about his body a cord made of ardour that had been rubbed furiously against the stone idol of his older brother's false charms. Like a proper daemon, Itake's office was to cause fools to fall in lust with him and make them do his bidding to hell and beyond. Who knew, his brother was just wicked. If Suzuki were to collect the missives, painstakingly perfumed and passionately penned, his brother received from strangers every week, he would be able to make a comforting grave for him, with a fine and chiseled slab that read, "He was dearly loved." They harbored hopes in their breasts that they might converse with the Umbu commander, who was cold to matters physical in nature, so they dreamt of submission if required by him, passively. This man, too, had officiated as an accidental Umbu lackey of his devil brother and an optimistic receiver of his lord's, devil's, most coveted kiss so sacred, right on his lips. Oh, to be so nurturing of the dream that made skin and voice tremor, tenderly so undone, right by his feet. Silly, silly, silly. He had a sudden inclination to laugh. What do you hope to gain from him? Suzuki asked, unable to stop the tremble of amusement in his voice, and he saw Kai's contours change and turn meaner. He was prone to process complicated emotions with refusals and frowns than by actions. I don't know what you... You know what I mean, Suzuki cut across him, his smile, full of meaning, deepening like the color in his skin. Don't play games. If I can see it, so can he. You're fooling no one. Wind blew in, but Kai did not weep to his dismay. In his eyes, a depth of color flourished, a kind that Suzuki had not witnessed before. Kai opened and snapped his mouth shut, with visible anger in his eyes and face. He was glowing as red as lush tomatoes. To say something to this young one now would incur the other one's wrath. It was like being crushed between the little devil and the older devil. There was no deep blue sea for Kai to find refuge and drown in. Your obedience will get you nowhere. He doesn't care, Suzuki spoke and placed a hand on Kai's shoulder and moved his eyes around. He doesn't care. Stop listening to him. He'll make you miserable like he makes me miserable. See? We're almost alike. Then he backed away with a soft laughter that sung in Kai's ears and left the boles of the forest and him all alone. Autumn's air laughed with the merry-making of children fast at play. The bud lurked behind the closed well some yards from where she stood in the library. It was empty, but his signs remained despite his absence, a wooden brush resting on the scroll, an open ink bottle, an old red lantern that was not lit. He worked in silence, and when he left, he cast off his silence like a well-worn garment in the rooms he visited to strangle her dreams. He had not called her to him for 2 nights. Almost demurely, Izumi touched her belly with one unsure hand. She could tell that it was empty. Worry cast gray upon her countenance that was paler than usual. He had not withheld his chakra from her, but his heart was not in the act, and no matter how many times she went near him for copulation with great enthusiasm, she saw no change in his bearing. He was always distant. He enjoyed the act, not her company, and her eyes, starved of an up-close viewing before, could only glut on his beauty for so long. Colors of him had flooded her barren visions and gone over the brim of her girlish eyes many times over. They needed more. She needed more from him now. Maybe the child would change him, she thought. It was a good thought. Men altered their behaviors to accommodate to the needs of their children, often, but to him, Suzuki was his firstborn, and firstborn sons were dearest to men. She released a long and frustrated breath. She did not understand him. Suzuki was not his son. He was not. Why, oh, why was he moved by the little one, his outbursts, pleas, entreaties? Why was he so strange? Izumi walked to the door that was open and stood in the doorframe, feeling a cooler breeze go through her kimono and slide along her body. Then she thought of him. which she often did, and of lust of which he was capable. When the natural heat arose in him, his flesh heard its supplication and hardened and moved. He was a man like any other man under the spell of the body's needs. He was no avowed atheist battling against the religion of physical attractions, he just knew the trickeries to hide things well. Yet he sighed less whilst he filled her and brought her love and the girl in her to naught, of which she penned on the scrolls at the feeble dictations of a girl's heart. If his disinterest continued, he would send her home after the birth of his son, and she did not want to part from him, not ever. Something had to give. Izumi turned away from the garden, upon which tear-sized and light-bespeckled droplets sat trembling, and sat down by the table he utilized for work. In curiosity, she opened the drawer and looked at the properly arranged things, scrolls, brushes, ink bottles, and a neatly folded cloth placed beside a large brush. It was red as blood, silky as autumn's flower, and she took it out and pressed it to her nose, and a potent but crumbling fragrance escaped the threads that evoked the passing strips of her little sister's memories, who lost her life to fever in infancy. She could almost smell the presence of lavender in her twisting hair, see the color in her curving smile, feel the smooth cream in her blushing skin. The smell transported her back in time, trapped by the confines of her mind's prison, and Izumi was lost. She held the cloth close to her breast, her vision entombed in the wondrous world of worlds. Then, as though she felt his presence near, she looked at the door and jumped to her feet. It was Itaki, and he stood in the door. It was difficult to discern the nature of his features that were overwhelmed by the moonwhite of his skin. He looked at her, stepped into the room, but said nothing. He had put up his hair in a tight ponytail again, arranging it well with a ribbon, that most of it hung straight and sleek at the back of his neck, and some of it, lank and loose, framed his face. Fully dressed, he stood tall and fair in his umbu uniform. He was leaving somewhere? It was the fantastic operation of the mind that made Izumi take note of his appearance again, and albeit she was pretty and girlish in an effervescent sense, she thought that she looked very common in his presence. This truth was made more apparent by the light that was kinder to the coldest places of him. She was a woman, and she envied him and his perfection. Itaka was quiet whilst he looked down at the fist that clutched the red cloth tightly, and then up at the full force of redness that appeared in her cheeks, together with a disorderly collection of sweat droplets. She stole glances at his smooth face. He looked calm, but knowing him, a storm of anger could be brewing in his breast right about now. Itaka-sama, Izumi stopped, words lost in her throat, fear and anxiety blurred her vision. Why are you? Itaka stopped at the quick sounds of steps and rustling of wet foliage that came from the garden, and Suzuki appeared within moments at the garden door that lay open. She thanked Kami that he showed up. She was happy to see him. Itaka looked at Suzuki, and swiftly, she placed the cloth back inside the drawer. Itaka cast her a quick glance, but stayed silent. Suzuki removed his sandals at the steps and stepped into the room, and spoke, "Leave. I need to talk to him." And just like that, anger for him replaced happiness. "Suzuki, you don't speak to me that way." "I won't." "Leave," Itaka cut across her in a voice that was sweetly acidic. Izumi blinked, taken aback by the lack of censure in his words, and red flecked the whites of her eyes in anger, but she did not want to displease the clan's heir, so she gave a stiff and reluctant bow and marched out of the room amidst the clouds of perfume that originated from her garments and sounds of jewelry that clinked in her hair. "I have sent her away like you asked," Itaka spoke, and he was demure, silver-tongued again whilst he approached him. Suzuki said nothing, his anger enveloping his features in a tidal wave. How he loathed this act Itaka performed. He was not an audience to his theatrics. "What is it this time, you sweet child?" He whispered and smiled, and a layer of mischief pulled back from his face, delicately, slowly, as though he was sincere in his words and steady in his promises, an idol of nature's legerdemain. He could not fool him. Suzuki threw the scroll in his hand at the small table. It bounced off the surface and fell down in a clatter of ink bottle and brushes. Black spread across the white of scroll, and few letters Itaki had created and dripped off the sides. Drop by drop his table was in a mess. "Why make such a mess?" Itaki remarked, his manner lazy and unconcerned. "You have created more work for an old man. Are you satisfied?" It was common cold. Suzuki spoke with a frowning visage that resembled that of an incensed and innocent boy's. "Is that so? You should be glad, or did you want the poor man to perish for your report?" You will get another chance at a deadlier ailment. Do not be a cruel child, he spoke, and wisps of light made his tear troughs more pronounced that he looked like a crow whose outer mask was fashioned like the charming face of a perfect theater actor. You knew. He hissed this time, anger ringing in the sound of his voice, rough and demanding. My, we have a temper this morning. I am even letting you meet up with the Hojiki boy at the outpost at dusk. What more should I do to please you? He spoke, and the way he spoke his words caused Sasuke to become hyper-aware of the claustrophobic cacophony that reigned supreme in Itaka's presence. Itaka's library was a tomb of Sasuke's boyhood dreams. You think I don't know? Sasuke spoke and stepped closer and noticed no hint of change in Itaka's demeanor. You're doing this on purpose to humiliate me. You circle around protocols to do as you please. Your son isn't even born yet, and look at you. Already hoarding all the authority in the clan and in your office. How dare you? Angry. So angry, Itaka spoke in a soothing voice, looking at the deep of the shades assimilating to blood in his sibling's eyes. Calm your heart. Why are you always angry with me? Why do you displease me? Why do you not do as I say? I do everything for you. Should that not make you happy? It should. I am your brother, your father, your mother now. You should put your trust in me, no one else. I am not your foe. You are my child, and you do not know how it hurts me when you do not listen. I do not want to see you anguished, for it breaks my heart that you are hurting over things that should never matter. Not everything matters. You should know. Let them sleep. Let your anger sleep, too. Apparelled in the light, he was beautiful, kingly, smiling, and his smile flushed red into the white of him. What a trickster! His fingers, long like hairless spiders' legs and soft like moth's wings, moved against Sasuke's cheek as if he was feeling his contours in the dark, and he bent down and planted a kiss to his brow. At that curious and unfortunate moment, Kai stepped into the room. However, Itaka did not look at him, too absorbed in his siblings' declarations regarding his future plans to prolong the quarrel between them. Your tricks and wordy dialogues. They're nice, Sasuke said, sharing on glowing and growing to appear as a flower in his eyes. You don't get to decide how I treat the matter of my clan and parents. You don't. You're not my father and you're not my mother. You're just a liar. I'll call a clan's meeting soon, and then we'll see how long you enjoy this power. You're not the only one who knows how to play around the rules, Nii-sama. The honorific hissed from his mouth, and then he turned around, wore his sandals, and walked away from Itaka, and to Kai's utmost shock, he saw reds of amusement flecking Itaka's eyes and lips. He lowered his eyes and face at once when Itaka looked at him, all traces of amusement gone from his face. Itaka approached him and the manner of his walk was ominous. He stopped a step short of him and looked down, and Kai, up. Light was bright and fresh behind Kai's back whilst he stood inside his lord's shadow, and the yellow crown of kings was most glorious upon his head. You have made a little mess again when I told you not to, Itaka spoke and cast the table a brief glance and returned his eyes to Kai's awestruck face. If not provoked, he is usually never this angry, yet he threatened his brother with consequences this time. Did you say something to him? Itaka-sama, I tried, but he didn't list, and he could speak not one more word as Itaka grabbed him by the throat, with his fingers digging against the trembling rings of his windpipe. I asked of you to take him to the northern outposts first, he spoke, and his tongue was easy and sweet in his mouth again, yet you gave him the task I had reserved last for him. Why would you do this? It is as if you exhibit this behavior on purpose. I have not even asked of you to come clean about the bruise on his breast. Are you testing when my patience ends? Itaka lifted Kai up by the neck that he stood on his tiptoes to meet Itaka at eye level, and he saw, in terrible fear and awe, arrogance, and anger furiously compete to take hold of the deep domain in Itaka's eyes. Neither won, neither lost, but his eyes remained as menacing and black as before. I didn't do anything, Itaka-sama, he said clearly, for the grip was still tender. The first words that come from a man's lips are always a lie. Itaka spoke and increased the pressure against the pronounced ridges of Kai's throat that he saw whites and reds mingle in bursts inside his unhelpful vision. What use do you have for me if you keep creating messes, little messes that increase my worries? After all, you were granted this office for a purpose. I swear it I didn't, Kai said as though words were wrung from his throat with great force. He could barely breathe, and his throat was filled with fire. And, now, you are swearing like a fool, he whispered, his voice slightly hissing in Kai's ears. I always tell you to stay quiet if he says something in anger, but you enjoy bickering with a boy. You find joy in this playtime. Is that why you bruised him, for you wanted to play? Kai shook his head with the little will left in him, but his words reduced the ruler of Kai's world, his heart, to a trembling and shamed little boy. He wanted to weep in the corner, with his head against the wall, but he had no air in his throat to create a plea. Itaki had intensified his grip on him, any more pressure and he might break his neck in two. The little puffs that remained in his trachea poked from the inside to locate a passage to his mouth, and his Sherinon fell asleep under the depths of blacks in shame and fear. He was unsure if it would ever resurface to grant him pride. I do not enjoy the thought of you wanting to play with the boy. Do you want me to split your throat in two and send the remains to your dear sister for her eternal lamentations? I hope you do not want her to write haikus about your broken neck whilst she weeps alone in the house. Till her remaining years, Itaki spoke with tenderness that was sincere and sinister, and suddenly, his murderous grip on Kai's throat softened. He slumped to the floor onto his knees, hands going to his red throat, coughing. Do not pursue him any longer. I will take care of matters myself. Leave. Kai lifted his eyes, and it took great skill for his hasty Sherinon to animate the flurry of images in the world about him. Air filled his throat like water and cleaned the traces of pain little by little, and behind Itaki stood Serizawa with a deeply concerned and remorseful look on his features. Itaki turned around and picked up his sword from the rack, and thinking that he might use it to threaten him again, Kai gathered his body to a standing position, letting his gaze drift back down in obedience. He said nothing, touched his throat once, and left the room. Did you give the girl child the gold? Itaki asked after Kai left the room and sheathed his sword, which shone as rays touched the steel. Serizawa, almost taken off guard by his gentle tone of voice for the briefest moment, nodded. Yes, Itaki-sama, but she asked to meet with you. I didn't say anything to her. Perhaps you should talk to her again. She's very young. She might make a mistake. Do you like children, Serizawa? He asked and turned to face him, and his eyes glinted even inside the room's meek shadows. Yes, I do. I love children. They're sweet and innocent in a manner adults are not, he replied, heart beating faster at the strange question the young heir posed. A full smile crossed Itaki's lips. This time he was amused. You love children, yet you are almost endearing, like a child yourself, he spoke, and wind, in a playfulness of mood, plucked at his hair and loosened a dark strand to drift about his face, and he looked mischievous as though he was up to no good. And a sunny and embarrassed smile rose to Serizawa's mouth, but he said nothing. He followed Itaki as he walked out of the house. He stopped by the well to look at Suzuki standing by the stream at the garden's far end, with Izumi by his side. He had the sudden urge to move in that direction to stop the quarrel that was inevitable, but he did not. Children, he spoke, as if to himself, and looked ahead. You should decide upon the day we are to meet with the girl child, yes? I do not want to delay this matter any longer. Serizawa nodded and followed him out of the garden, and out of the Uchiha village, and both men left the makings of the deadliest storm in their wake. Suzuki stood by the stream, his reflection disturbed endlessly by ripples. He sat down on the thick pillowy grass that shivered in wind. The grass was wet, not muddy. Upon feeling his presence, koi slipped to the surface in urgency, their round mouths, enlarging and contracting, showed above water, releasing silver bubbles which burst as soon as they touched the surface. He reached into his pocket and took out a pouch, and then he began feeding the fish, which were impatient, boiled rice. Izumi stood not far from him, but he ignored her presence. He was in no mood to argue with her. Wind came at them, and, as her kimono layer floated up, he noticed that she was quite thin-ankled. The jewelry chinked and clinked in her hair, a discordant music which affected the natural tunes of the new storm. After a few minutes of listening to it, his head began to hurt. He rubbed his hands together, shoved the pouch into his pocket, rose up. At this, she made a sudden movement towards him, but stopped midway. He paid her no mind and turned around to leave, and that was when she spoke. Itaki-sama's unfair to you. I feel for you. It wouldn't hurt him to be a little gentle. She bent her head with a sudden movement and looked about the grass in embarrassment. Suzuki stopped, turned a little, feeling the full force of wind hit the front of his body. Sky was turning dark and dreadful. What kind of storm was this that was so quick to form again? That's my business. You don't need to worry about me, he spoke, his voice devoid of roughness or smoothness. Quickly, Izumi raised her head, and he noticed a secret in her eyes and face. Nervous and blushing, she had something on her tongue, and it got him curious. If he pushed her just enough, she would spill it sooner than later. I mean it. She almost shouted and darted her eyes about the house, fearful of Itaka's presence. She was very strange the way she lusted for him and feared him, too. He's not good to you. Izumi continued and took a step forward and enlarged her eyes for dramatic emphasis. She looked almost frantic, almost silly. He's mean and unfair. You should go to the council. You're an heir, too. He shouldn't treat you like this. Suzuki looked down and saw her hands shaking, not from cold but from fear. Don't talk about Nii-sama like that, he spoke and looked up to meet her dull brown eyes that were rendered more intense by her frightened state. I told you, it's my business, not yours. Why do you keep getting involved in things that don't concern you? You should sit in the guest rooms and look pretty. That's why Oba-san brought you here. His words stung her like a buzzing spiral of gnats, for his mystic beauty, a source of her enduring envy, could never charm her heart. The carefully twisted hairs that hung at her shoulders frizzled to attention, so did the fine golden ones on her arms and nape. Anger sent up into her cheeks a more radiant shade that she began to resemble an embittered child with a bloated face. Lord Sage. She looked livid and very silly equally. Don't speak to me like that, you bitter child. Izumi retorted, bending forward, clenching her fingers into fists. You've got no right to insult me. When I become. If you become his wife, Suzuki forestalled her before she could complete her words. I don't know what Oba-san sees in you, but you took care of her when she was ill. She feels deeply indebted. There are many women in the clan who are prettier and wealthier than you. I've heard that Kai's sister is the most beautiful woman in the clan. Kuro. She's barren. She spat out, her countenance warped, red, and angry. Ah, you're jealous, he said, smiling, enjoying her anger, but you're right. That's the only reason she couldn't make it to Nii-sama's bed. Lucky for you, huh? And I'm not wrong, Izumi said whilst she backed away, taking a deep and long breath with which her breast rose, and composed herself. Itaka-sama doesn't care about you. It's true. I told you to mind. Why don't you ask your friend? She said and made a big smile, teeth and all. That runt who looks a bit blue, what was his name? Ah, Sui Suijitsu. He knows. Why don't you ask him what your brother did to you? Suzuki straightened his body and raised his hand to wipe at his face and spoke, his voice acerbic. He was expecting her to spill something humorous. Not this. What are you talking about? You were screaming you were blind. He'd used his genjutsu on you, Izumi said, and her smile that grew dangerous like a smudge of blood was a misplaced decoration on her made-up face. Swiftly, Suzuki grabbed hold of Izumi's arm and yanked her forward and hissed, I don't like you, I never have. The sooner you leave here, the better. You have no shame. You're so desperate to stay that you'd lie about something like this. Fear and anger came and went in short and rapid bursts into her eyes. Her breathing was heavy, burdened, but she had come to him with a purpose. A quarrel in the council hall? Itaka would cast her aside and leave her abandoned with her girlhood dolls, her dreams. His mind would come to be occupied, with force, by this boy's theatrics, and her darling son would lay weeping and forgotten by his father in the cold of winter nights. To hell with him, she would not let him ruin her like this. You always hurt me. I want you gone. Izumi said with honesty, her words coming out like a shout over the wind whose rising echo was a foreboding sign of anger. I'm not lying. I don't lie, your brother's a liar. She was weeping now, tears streaking through the powder on her face, which she applied day and night to match the white of Itaka's winter white skin tone. Suzuki let go of her arm, body shaking, sherry non coming out like a loose tide into the black, like a sinister massacre of men at night. He did not wait around, and, after gazing up at the clouds that drifted across the sun, he left the garden with a renewed conviction in his steps. It must have been midday when Suzuki saw the outpost's wooden pillar loom up from between the peaks, adorned with red and gold foliage. He walked down the little hill, his steps steady, looking down at the burst of flowers lying deep in the fragrant and pillowy grass. This outpost was a depot, but it had little capacity to hold large supplies of weapons, food, and medicine for armed shinobi in times of war. He never understood its purpose, and Fire Country had many depots like this one, sprinkled about in the forests that blanketed a large part of the country. When Suzuki approached the gate, half of which was obscured by tall grass, the guard recognized him. The stout man made a smile and bowed towards Suzuki and opened the gate. It was sturdy and made from wood, with seals inscribed on its extremities. The grass on the grounds was short, cut all year round by few men wielding chakra-sharpened sickles. It was thick enough that it absorbed most rain and stayed lush throughout the year, save winter. Turning to his Sharingan's vision, he saw smooth and long plumes of chakra lift from the ground at his arrival. They must have been visible without Sharingan, too, chakra breaths. They usually appeared at night by the groves when it was dark and moon was high, but it was deep gray in the sky, and they, like confused fairies, fluttered about at his chakra's call. Suzuki breathed in a deep breath as he looked around at the row of quarters, his ears filling with clink-clinks the particles put out whilst they collided with one another in hopeless movements. His heart jumped and anger recollected its intensity, which it had lost during this small journey. At the sight of Suijitsu's chakra in one of the quarters, he was bent over an old bed, rooting through the contents of his bag which always smelled like the oldest leather. He steeled himself and walked through the orbs, pale whites against the grays of air and sky, that bounced off his body in gentle and slow motions. With every step he took, his anger swelled, his hand went to his back to wrap around the sword's hilt, and his intentions of vengeance and destruction compounded onto one another. His Sharingan had grown to maximum effect, which caused expulsion of sinister chakra into the area. Suijitsu did not even see him, but he felt him first. Suzuki gave him little chance to move when he came through the door and had him against the wall before his heart could ease into the motion of another beat, with the sword to his throat. The sharp end had only touched Suijitsu's skin, and instantly, a mark of blood appeared on the steel that was smooth and beautiful as moon rays. "Nice to see ya, too," Suijitsu said, his lavender-colored eyes big and large. This was not good. "I'm going to ask you this just once," Suzuki hissed, eyes hissing louder than his mouth. "Is it true that Nii-sama used Tsukuyomi on me? How many times?" What? He questioned, utterly terrified. "How many times?" He snarled this time and pulled Suijitsu forward and slammed him back against the wall. This little rough housing made every single bone in his body ring like a separate instrument. Colors of pain appeared in his eyes like blots of ink raining down from the sky. "Who told ya?" he asked, surprise clear and resounding in his choking voice. Suzuki's torso was pressed against his, and his weight was oppressive, dangerous, cruel. Suzuki backed away and allowed him to pull in a full breath. Suijitsu slid down to the floor and looked up at Suzuki's sharp features, which drew shadows upon their impeccable arrangement, frozen in utmost shock. His eyes glowed, more in anguish and less in anger, in his face. He looked like a hurt child that had tasted the bitter taste of anger for the first time. "Izumi," Suzuki answered in a tight whisper after recollecting his thoughts again, "she'd never lie about something like this. If she'd known this sooner." "What a floozy," Suijitsu remarked and let out a little chuckle that rang louder in silence and dimness that remained in this room. The grounds were empty and winds strong. "Why did you lie?" Suzuki asked, and breaths hissed into his mouth in anger that was raw and real as storms. You ungrateful runt." The spiteful rage in his voice struck Suijitsu and he flinched. After a long silence, in which Suijitsu felt trapped underneath Suzuki's shadow, he let slip a little whisper, "I'm sorry." "How long have you known, huh? How long?" Suzuki asked and took one step forward and his hand clenched tighter on the hilt. "Did he fill your poor mouth with gold? Did you enjoy it? Did you like humiliating me to do his bidding? How long, how long?" And his shout beat against the walls of the room and winds of the storm and frame of the feeble Hojiki, loud, commanding, bitter. "I did all af it." Suijitsu shouted this time, rising to his feet with swiftness, and his shout matched his. Am a poor cunt like ya say. Ungrateful, too, ya know? Am like that, am just a cunt always been a lil cunt. Sage knows am not proud af it, but what can ya do? It's pride or livin', and I ain't got the heart to keep lickin', pride that never did me good. Ya can't sleep on pride when ya stomach's growlin' and empty. It hurts at night hurts. And in the light that came sweetly and softly from the spaces between fog that hovered over the ground outside, Suzuki saw droplets materializing in Suijitsu's eyes. One by one. I've never worked for ya. Ya brother had gold, and I needed it ta feel like a man ta feel like I can be something, too, he said with trembling lips and took a weary step and slumped down onto the bed that squeaked. There's nothing worse than bane poor nothin'. Ya look at full plates and ya look at ya mum weepin' in empty rooms, tunin, to bones, and ya stop carin' cause what can ya do but look and feel pity? It's a bitch. Suijitsu passed his hand over his head and face that, in the lantern's falling light, looked scared and ashamed. I didn't want to do nothin' af it ta ya I didn't, he paused and pulled in a sharp breath, had no choice. Was afraid af bonesin', empty platesin', rains that came down on ya when ya thought ya felt safe in the night. Ya said ya liked the rain and storm. I hate em so much. They beat ya down. They shame ya that ya got no roof over ya head. Folks look at ya funny when ya clothes are torn and ya smell like a bitch on the street a good for nothin' bum. Suijitsu breathed in and out the storm-enticed air several times that rushed in torrents into the room, and by his side, lantern's light flickered and flung yellows and grays over his countenance tightened in concentration and contemplation. At this moment, he looked tragically adult. I got tired af it everything. Didn't want to be poor. I never want to be poor, he said and wiped at his eyes and nose with a quick movement of his hand. I don't know how many times ya brother did this to ya. I only know bout 3. My first pouch of gold was bout findin' ya cause ya was lost in the forest ya was mad. I swear to Sage he was happy to see that ya was not hurt. He ain't so bad. He's mad I know, but he ain't so bad. At least, he ain't like me brother liked to stick swords in me neighbor's arse when he called I'm a bum faggot. Mum told me, but she was all skin and bones when she said that. She might have just been a mad ol' crone. He wanted me to hide it from ya. He never told me why. I don't know, mate. Am just ramblin'. Suijitsu raised his head in Suzuki's direction, and he saw him walking into the maze of grays, and within moments, he disappeared from sight. Suijitsu did not know when he had walked away from him. When Itaki reached his house, he looked up and saw a heart in the yawning sky's breast. A flood of black was rising up fast from behind the hills, which appeared menacing at this hour. It would be night soon. Inside, it was quiet save for the whispers of women from his grandmother's room, too quiet. He had faith in Suijitsu's promises, but the Hojiki man kept his legs in 2 boats. He was not trustworthy. He went to Suzuki's room first, opened it, and looked at the darkness that surrounded the red lantern. It looked new, unlike the one he used for his room and library, gifts from a father to his sons. Suzuki had taken care of the gift, which was his to keep forever. Itaki-sama, you're home early, Tanaka rasped, his steps slow and creaking on the wooden floor. Shall I arrange dinner for you? I've cleaned the mess in the library. The child Izumi must have dropped the ink. Young girls can be clumsy. She will learn not to mess with your things. He smiled, and then, his eyes popped out as if he just remembered something quite important and added, he's not home. Where is he? Did you not stop him from leaving? Itaki asked and closed the door. Itaki-sama, he stopped and rubbed his aged and venous hands together in anxiety. You know he doesn't listen to me. I did stop him, but he said that he'd be back before dusk. I don't know why he's not back. He slumped his rounded shoulders further, appearing even smaller than he was. Itaki looked at the paper screen, on which light inked the curves of shivering boughs in the garden, and without the crescent's presence up in the sky, they presented themselves with a unique blackness against the lantern's light and imprint, an artificial splendor of which he knew all too well. It is dark, yet he has not come back. Itaki spoke and gazed in the direction of the main door, indecisive. You can arrange the dinner when he comes back. I will wait for him. Then he went to his library, placed the untouched sword in the rack, sat down by the low table. It was clean, like Tanaka had said, and everything was in place again. Coal burnt red-hot in the portable brazier, releasing a faint smell of burnt ash. The garden door was still open, and outside, wet flora made mist appear in form of thin upward-moving lines over the gray sheet in the background. He saw the black burn white with blue flickers at the sky's far end. A storm was rolling over the peaks there with all its power. Mercifully, this patch of land had escaped its wrath. He lit the lantern and increased the flame, and light streamed along the contours of everything it touched. The red paper was frayed and had turned so old. No matter how many times he adjusted the flame, this red was subdued, and the Uchiha fan pattern, no less muted in its intensity. Turning his face, Itaka picked up the clean brush. In this light's nature that was languid, half of his unblemished countenance resembled a sliver of strident moon, the other half, a mask of vague red. He wrote one letter and looked at the garden again, the clutched brush poised over the circular ink pot. He put the brush down, not caring that its wet end left on the scroll a smudge that only grew in size. He breathed in the air that came from the garden, and as if he had taken a swig of sake, he leaned his head and back against the wall and closed his eyes, waiting. Itaka woke up to the tinkling of the falling rain, his vision swayed and focused on the droplets that fell down from the roof in strings. Looking at the sky above the tree limbs, he noticed the diluteness of black at the sky-splitting horizon. Had he fallen asleep? He sat upright, his senses fresh and sharp again. Coals had turned gray and cold in the brazier that, now, two thin smoke strips traveled up air's fabric. He wanted to have breakfast, but he did not feel particularly hungry, and it was getting late, and he had to visit the border before midday. He decided to delay his need till noon. Smelling the smell of lilies about him, he got up and left the confines of the library. It took him an hour to perform his morning ablutions and change into fresh umbu garments. By the time he was ready, black had lost most of its thickness. The arc began to appear more and more translucent at the loss of night's oppressive control. Morning was not far. Itaka visited his chamber to get a scroll, and when he stepped out, Tanaka greeted him with a worried face. "Itaka-sama, won't you have breakfast? You didn't eat anything last night, too," he said, sounding rough and old. "He didn't come home last night. I wanted to wake you, but you should have woken me up," he spoke, his tone of voice stern, not harsh, but Tanaka knew that he was very displeased. He bowed and watched Itaka leave the house with a temper. After he entered the forest's boundary, it took him a moment, courtesy of a special teleportation mark nearby which only the Umbu captain and few more were aware of, to reach the outpost where Suijitsu dropped off his resignation letter. The guard told him that Suzuki came to meet with the man, but he left the outpost alone. Suijitsu left here without a soul, as well. He did not understand the child. Was he still angry over a small argument between them? Itaka delayed the border matter for later. He had to find Suzuki. What if Suijitsu had said something to him? He rejected the thought. It was a fear born of irrationality, and Suijitsu was too fragile and dependent on the work he gave him to survive. At the end of the day, thoughts of constant hunger that came scuttling from the past were his greatest fear. Thankfully, Itaka's task was made easy by the man, whom he met on his way to the office, from the training grounds. He told him that Suzuki was staying in one of the empty quarters on the grounds. Due to the arrival of a biting winter, many shinobis who came for training had left Konoha. Wedged between the mountains and forests, the hidden leaf turned brittle in winter and had no training programs, only expensive shinobis for hire. It was early in the morning when Itaka reached the grounds. Rain stopped, but the sky had hidden away its nature behind winter's coming melancholy. He crossed the grounds, upon which graying grass moved glimmering. Fog grew thick like trunks in front of him, and he was forced to draw upon his clan's sight in need. He did not stop walking, his walk slow and calm, his eyes upon Suzuki's chakra that flared and bared his present mood deep purple in between the vertical crossings of chakra breaths. It seemed as if he was looking at him through the spaces between the lattice door. The door was open, and when Itaka crossed the threshold, it began to rain behind his back. It was a soft rain, thin and soothing its sounds. Itaka stopped and looked around. The room was small and stuffy with a set of drawers and one bed. Suzuki sat in the large window, his one leg bent and cramped inside the tight window frame, and unsurprisingly, albeit Suzuki was aware of his brother's presence, he paid him no mind. Rain fell onto Suzuki's left cheek and eye and coursed across to the other side, leaving light-coated droplets in its wake. His expression was odd, his half-lidded eye, one which Itaka could see, rain-filled and dull. Suzuki blinked after every few heartbeats, as if out of natural habit, but he did not look his way. This silence between brothers bothered the older one, so he decided to intrude upon the calm of the younger one first. I did not stop you from taking the matter to the council. Then why are you still angry with me? At his question, he saw Suzuki take 2 breaths with quick movements of his breast, and after one beat, he spoke in a voice that was harsh like a half-formed growl, "Leave. I don't want to talk to you. Come. Do not be this way." Itaka spoke, and his voice, though sweeter than rain, hurt Suzuki's pride so much that he did not think possible. Itaka was mocking him, he was always mocking him. And this thought filled his mortal coils with unimaginable rage. Suzuki stepped back into the room, stood up straight, and looked at him, and the red of him. No, all of him was red tonight. He was a trickster, a liar, a theater actor. And he had turned him, his younger sibling, into an instrument of his lies. He did not move from where he stood, and Itaka noticed that dullness receded in Suzuki's eyes, replaced by a glint that was still being warmed by his anger. "I told you to leave, get out of here," he said in the same tone again, cast the open door a glance, frowned a frown that sunk deep into his face. "What has got you so upset?" Itaka asked, almost experiencing something close to a mild case of disbelief. "Did Izumi quarrel with you? I will send her home if she did. Did Kai say something brash to you? He will be remorseful if he did. Did Suijitsu let slip a little lie? He will be taught a great lesson if he did. Tell me, why are you so displeased? Are you worried about Suijitsu?" Suzuki asked and moved and stopped at arm's length from him, and Itaka looked, with eyes narrowed and red, at the lightest of grays cast upon the expanse of Suzuki's childlike face. "You child, are you playing a game of riddles with me?" Itaka asked and watched how his shadow traced the lines of his sibling's countenance like free-flowing ink. "Come. Tell me who displeased you, and I will decide what needs to be done." Thunder tumbled far away, and this distant sound was joined by a faint whisper from Suzuki's mouth, "You did many times, but I never knew. Kai, that bastard. He's no different from you. You're a weasel like the men whose company you keep. A liar." Itaka's cultivated features took on a severe air, and opening his hand fully, he struck Suzuki across the cheek. His face turned to the side and pink appeared in white almost immediately. "Disrespectful child. You have grown shameful in that boorish boy's company," he spoke slowly, calmly, and grabbed Suzuki by the thick of his arm. "Come now. You're lying to me right now," he said, right and fizzing around his hand and taking a proper shape. "Tell me, how many times did you use your genjutsu to drive me mad?" Dragging air into his lungs with astronomical force, he fueled the fires that burnt as ferociously as demons in his face that was so reminiscent of a boy's face. He had never seen Suzuki so angry. Suzuki moved towards Itaka so swiftly that he barely managed to flicker a little to the left and catch his arm before his hand made contact with his body, and, had Suzuki's body not been trembling in anguish and rage and weakness, the sharp end of his jutsu would have gone clean through Itaka's shoulder. He flung Suzuki around into the wall and pressed up against him, his grip tight around the chakra-dripping wrist. "Calm down," Itaka spoke, his voice smooth, whilst he twisted Suzuki's wrist to block the chakra-carrying coils that transported live chakra to his hand's exit points. It was no use. This trick had little effect on nearly, robust Suzuki's impossibly potent chakra. "Let go!" Suzuki shouted and pushed forward and radiated Raiden from his whole body. However, before the surge could enter Itaka's system, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a needle-like instrument, jammed it into Suzuki's neck's one side, and then the other lines of blood jumped forth from the tiny wounds and streamed vertically down the nape. The act shocked Suzuki's senses, and he blinked and enlarged his eyes with each jab. His Sharingan gleamed once with all its might and went out. Itaka had punctured the primary chakra coil at 2 places that connected the Sharingan to the body. This primary coil lay deep inside the neck. He did not want to resort to this, but he had no choice. Suzuki's body went limp and a dark sludge fell into his eyes. Instinctively, Suzuki touched his neck. He could see nothing. Grabbing both of Suzuki's wrists, Itaka threw him down to the floor and pressed his knee down into his convulsing breast. Suzuki was not backing down. "Stop this, calm down," he spoke again, voice less smooth this time, and watched small pools of red spread outwards on the floor, away from the origins. And from where Itaka sat, they were darker than the color of his blood. Suzuki freed one of his wrists and grabbed Itaka by the neck, but his lungs were not full to make his body work the way he wanted. He coughed, Itaka's knee squeezing the breaths out of him, and his fingers slipped on his brother's throat and left long red streaks across his skin. Itaka took hold of Suzuki's wrist again, and, after some moments of thrashing, Suzuki did not struggle anymore. He started laughing. "You bastard, damn you!" He coughed out between laughter and turned his face towards the floor. "Suijutsu bites the hand that feeds him. Your company will ruin you," Itaka spoke, looking at the boy whose laughter echoed away upon the wind. "He didn't tell me anything." He stopped and licked his lips whose rosy fleshes clove to each other in thirst and hunger. "I squeezed it out of him." He folded like a cheap flak jacket. "You thought I wouldn't find out? Fuck you." Itaka removed his weight from him and stood up. "I did everything to protect you. You may not understand it now, but it is true." He spoke and gazed at Suzuki whilst he sat up and pressed his back against the wall. Itaka could tell that he still could not see a thing. "Protect me." Suzuki spoke, his voice approaching a shout, turned his head and blind eyes in Itaka's direction, felt wind's music against the wetness on his nape. "You had no right to do what you did. You had no right, you bastard, you liar." "Lair." Suzuki trembled and his torso jerked forward with the brutality of fury that hit his body with lashing strokes, and the sound from his throat, rumbling deep and piercing high, beat about the walls like lightning. Suzuki's anger was too much, and Itaka felt a deeper and crueler one of his own, rich, ripe, reaping in his heart's chambers and eyes coils that dragged in a sizzle of passion, and resting tomos spun and spun and spun and turned into shurikens that cut deeply into the glass of perfect red, a mystery created in the flesh by the hand of a murderer who had taken his own life. Suzuki did not see, did not feel the depth of his brother's cruelty. Child, what an innocent child. Itaka turned away from Suzuki and stopped at the threshold when he heard Suzuki shout behind him, "If I find out that you had something to do with the massacre, I'll kill you. Damn you, I'll kill you." And this time, albeit faint in the storm, his words were heard in rooms down the row, and one by one, lights came on in each room and whispers soon followed. Itaka looked at the glow of lights in the fog and felt raindrops cut across the pinks on his throat. Then he walked away in the direction of his house. Itaka did not know how long it took for him to reach his house, but he was dripping when he stepped in through the main door. Inside his eyes, shurikens spun in danger; outside, storm roiled in anger. He did not hide the mangekyo that stripped away the walls and broke them down into primal patterns of chakras, red being the most prominent, which came from the shuriken's cutting nature. And whilst Itaka approached the library, he felt that his anger needed the cold hand of his control. Izumi was standing with her back to the door when Itaka stepped into the library. Rao stood beside her with a scroll in her hands. His closeness forced Izumi to turn around, and she had barely registered the presence of shurikens in Itaka's countenance when his hand rose and struck her cheek with a lightning-swift twitch, and half of all the anger he felt inside. And albeit he did not channel much force into the strike, it was enough that it sent her stumbling back. She hit the back of her head against the rack and fell down in a cascade of scrolls onto the floor. The smacking sound rung in her ears, and her cheek burned hotter than the brazier and redder than the artificial blush she had applied there in the morning. "Itaka, no. Stop, no." Rao shouted and clutched Itaka's hand when he tried to raise it again. She stood before him and pressed her little body's whole weight against the front of his body. "How dare you?" Itaka spoke, his voice cold and slow. Izumi straightened her body and felt her cheek. Her hair had come loose and half of it lay over her forehead and other cheek. Brushing hair off her face, she looked at the ornamental pin that fell from her hair and him and wept with a soft exhalation. "Why did you do this?" he asked, his visage without a discernible expression, his eyes like that of a fiery zealot. "Do you have any idea what you have done? You fool! You have laid waste 2 years' worth of my patience. Everything I have done lies in ruin because of you. He will listen to me no longer. Why? Why would you do this?" Rao encircled his waist and pressed her face into the lower part of his torso. Izumi could hear her moaning. Izumi's face contained not a trace of anger, only hurt, and her stooped shoulders heaved convulsively. He had no pity for her in his face, much less his eyes that sung a voiceless tune demanding release, from which she was still safe. No one had the audacity to speak of that night, but you, he began, his arms, calm now, hung at his sides. You lied to me. How much did you see that night? I made one mistake, and you acted to remind me of it. Itake, my darling boy, forgive her. She did not mean to cause you any harm. Rao moaned and took his hands in hers and kissed them. Itake's shurikens cut lines across Izumi's body, and then he looked straight ahead at the painting that was darker under the slant of shadow in the alcove. Her womb is empty, he spoke, without a heart. If she is not gone from here by the time I return, I will take her to the gate myself. Then she will be responsible for her own shame. And then he left the library, and sounds of garden and sobs of girl together joined in unison with Storm's music. It was night, and air, drunk on autumn's perversions. He was sitting in a large chair made for a king. No, it was a poor imitation of that chair. The room was dark, its silence, darker. By his arm sat a lantern, its beams weak and pink on his skin. He waited, waited, waited. At last, a boy appeared from the shadow behind the curtain. Oh, what a beautiful boy, no older than 12, and his lord was 12 when he had seen him first, too. He remembered his lips, brash red, and petal-like. Kami had indulged in a palette of red, white, black to transform their creation's features into a godly visage. And this boy, this one right here, was a moonlit manifestation of the Lord he loved. A simulacrum not as perfect as the real thing, but the closest thing to perfection. The boy was not skilled to shield himself behind the facade of Winter's careless manner. He was innocent still, eyes big and wondrous and without red's taint. He was a boy still, body small and without youth's pain. He, too, was a boy at heart. His visage was not impenetrable like his lord's, and he trembled cold, and trembled bold whilst the boy sat on his knees as though he were here to offer a prayer and prostrate by his feet. He had spent so much gold to enjoy this little illusion. The boy's little mouth was parted open, affording the man a free indulgence, and when the boy freed him with little hands, his organ was bloated with blood. Circling his hand around the little throat, he felt himself, all of himself, slipping, stirring, turning like an eel inside the tight and wet tunnel of the boy. Oh, his small lips, wrapping around him and moving over and over again. It was bliss, heart joyous, his solitude vocal with the sounds of breaths joined to the boy's breaths. Leaning his head back, he watched lights falling and dissolving on the ceiling. The boy, his lord's coarser image, had gladdened his heart's abode. His poor heart that thundered and stopped when he released his burden between the pinkest lips. It was done. And when the nameless, beautiful boy walked away, he felt the silence on his heart once more. It did not matter. With this thought, he stepped outside into the forest. This place would be gone by tomorrow. Light fragrance carrying wind danced down from the mountain. It was late at night, and he had to return to his home. He made to walk when a voice stopped him. You engage in fruitless things, Kai. Shameful. Kai turned around and looked upon the conniving face of Kiryu. What do you want? Leave me be. Kai said, declaring his disinterest in him at this hour of night. Kiryu smiled and looked at the sign that offered wakasha services at various prices. The bathhouse's most beautiful boy was the most expensive. I asked of you to bring me news about what you saw in the boy's eyes, but you want to roll about in the wakasha all night. He spoke and walked into the light that came down from a large and round lantern. It was yellow, and its light caused the whites in his robes to turn into yellows, too. You will get something when I'm certain of something, Kai said, and calm crumbled away from his face. Don't come to me like this again. He did not stay, and albeit this night was still young, he left in the direction of his house, with an ache that still burnt. A Tale of Misfits, Part I. His face collapsed in stages, mist came across his eyes, old under the rough patch of eyebrows, his features crumpled, and his aged mouth sagged down. A wreath of smoke rose up into the cold-laden air, soaked in the odor of his last suffused breaths. He painted that little village, and he had painted it good and red. Honor. A whistling air slapped against the stones by the large stone lantern. From this perch, the house was black. Shadow and dark mingled, a mundane union. The hearth had gone cold in the room. He could not see a thing, not even a glint on the swords. His wife had cleaned them well. Come morning, she would have to clean him, 2 guts, blood, sweat in the snow. It would just freeze there the way meat did. Snow fell and guts stained the ground. They would never remain there for winter's complete blessing. Some things had to be washed away. Sweat and grime. Hair matted in clumps to the neck and the side of a face that bore time's grooves. Snow hung in his eyelashes and fresh sweat poured into his eyes. He wore the visage of a new pain on his face, sitting beneath the mirthful sky to emit the breaths that dragged out more than protesting bits of himself, yet when it came gliding upon muted steps to his heart it mattered little to his body, spirit that sought liberation in the deep of its arms. A serpent smile and a ripple that went to his mortal core. Rent asunder, soul shaking, dancing to the tunes. Honor. Name. Face. Gone. And, quietly, he sat, his voice lost in the midst of sighs, slumped deep into the depths of stained snow. Hands trembling, heart calling, bemoaning, and as he made one last desperate attempt to catch a firefly, a desire, he fell forward. His face met the smooth sheet of snow, eyes staring at the gray whirls above his last home and the silent figure of youth, with eyes red, who stood by the stone lantern. He had fulfilled his request, and then everything washed away and he was awash in wishes. Quiet. Still. Free. A shadow fell across a youth, red still watching the evanescent chukra flee the body in waves. It had gone very cold. Running from the shinobi was not easy. He was foolish when he scrambled into Dark's mouth, muscles tense, one arm flexed as he held his paws prized sword high, aiming towards the sky as though it was his mortal enemy, and it had chased him, driven him out of the fine city's cradle, a little pouch full of stones in his pocket, a heart of gold in his breast. Stolen. Rascal. A bloody rascal. Lightning was crooked and swift, violent flashes catching him beneath the leaning boughs, and thunder, a beast, hitting his bones and gripping his spine with the hand of a kami's fury catch him and make him pay. The kami was loud, but merciful, too. Earth shook, angry like his maw, and its vibrations went into his limbs, and a current sped through his body. So he ran, and he ran fast, and he ran with a reckless abandon, eyes searching in his crazed face, purple like eyes, cold as steel, sharp like wolves. Amidst the dark, amidst the mist, amidst the shadow that leapt at him like demons, his path ran along the forest's edges. Pebbles and stones lay cold and still, too heavy for the wind to move. Voices undulated through wind, and when he stopped and turned, to stare back from the watery curtain's edge, he saw a flash. Their voices died as he ran through to salvation, and he was free. When he came upon a cliff, his heart leapt in his breast. If he ran this way, he would leave the fools far behind. So he descended down the slick stones, rain beating against his old trousers, soaking through. He felt water glide down to his genitals, and he cursed Mother Nature, Kami, and all his damned whores. Outwitting a tackle was hard, mate. He went skittering down the pebbled peak, feet sure and firm. When his sandals braced down on the path, mist whirled about his feet. It was too cold, and from here, snow draped the dark humps that were valleys far off in the distance. Wind thinned the fog, and he could see a bit better. That was his destination. He ran, pumping force into his rippling muscles, and they worked on command. Voices behind his back had died. They were still searching, like headless roosters, in the forest for his signs, but rain plowed and racked the ground with brutality. His muddy prints had diminished in his wake that, now, men searched for other signs of his great escape: broken twigs, threads from his clothes, turned stones amongst other things. They would be disappointed. Rain stopped suddenly and moved away from his path. It was not well trodden and hard to trace in the dark. Grass grew tall here, taller than his hips, and he was obscured well in its vast rotten shade. He slowed down, heartbeats easing up in the wake of his decision. Wind turned nasty as he went, and sounds went into hiding, sucked up by night's nostrils. It had been hard to locate the big house of the greasy old man, but the young leader had managed it, somehow, though he never anticipated for him to go mad, dance, and murder in the light of his eyes. But things happened, and it was best to lock them away down secret skullets. Snow crunched beneath his sandals, a coating of frost lay over the earth. Nothing grew on trees, and crooked they stood in the full moon's light. His breaths grew heavy. He needed water. Why had he picked a time like this to pillage the bastard? He exhaled a slow breath and watched wisps of it appear in front of his face. Beyond the shadow, beyond the gravestones, which rose like stone limbs from the lumps in the ground, stood a large house, looming. He was late and he was cold. The young leader would not be happy. He passed his pointy teeth along the lips and proceeded forward. Fog parted and let him in. He sheathed the blade he had taken. The stones remained tucked away in his pocket. He slapped his hand on them once, just to be sure, and went through the open gate. There, beyond the hazy structures of stone lanterns, were a series of deep prints in the bed of snow. They ended near a recumbent figure that lay in a large red stain in the white. Though the smell was bearable, his innards had flowed out on the snow as twisting slime. Suijitsu raised his eyes and found him sitting on the highest step, with his feet on the third. A lantern glowed on his right, and light from it struck his cheek and made it glow more. His eyes had thought, unlike the snow, black and sober in his face. His sword was sheathed. He had not touched that man. No, the old man had taken his own life, driven mad by his eyes and their latent love. "You're late," he said, his voice frostier than snow, and one half of his face was cast in shadow. "It ain't easy being the thief," Suijitsu said, showing teeth and a smile. He shoved his numb hand, which had been throttled by rain, into his pocket and pulled out the leather pouch. He shook it a bit and smooth stones jangled inside. He threw it at the youth, and he caught it with a reflexive movement of his arm. He looked at it once, with an unreadable expression, and tucked it away inside his cloak. When he stood up, his cloak slackened over his shoulder, and he tugged it back in place. Then, as if out of habit to darken his countenance, he pulled the cowl over his head and wrapped a fold of the cloak over his mouth. Suijitsu could not see his face now. Suijitsu scratched his thigh. The coarse mixture of rain and sweat, and Kami knew what else, was making his skin itch real bad. He watched the youth make his way to him, leaving grey prints of his presence behind in the snow he had avoided treading through the visible stain. He did not stop and Suijitsu followed behind him. The house had gone silent. Mist rose, rolling upwards from the mounds as though they were expelling spirits of the dead man's ancestors. Smells of decaying earth and incense permeated the graveyard, and shadows flickered about the trees as clouds shifted and allowed light to shine down on them. "Where's the place?" he asked, traversing through the dry fauna that crackled beneath their sandals. "Close to Mist," Suijitsu said from behind, gaze on his back. "Yeah sure, yeah, even want to do this?" "Don't know, Suzuki, it could get messy." Suzuki did not answer for several long seconds, his breaths a little heavy in the cold. Suddenly, he stopped and turned around and his eyes glowed, as if in answer. "We can't get a safe passage into the village without him, and besides," he paused, drawing in a deep and long breath, which he let out in a slow sigh, "he promised me a scroll he stole from the Uchiha," and his voice vibrated at the end with a bit of amusement. Suzuki had grown weary of his former team by now. Suijitsu could not blame him. One was an obsessed and a bawling nutter, the other an enamored and inconstant state of heat nutter, and he had no clue who the porn-hoarding, masked-wearing nutter was. What kind of cunt hid half his face like that for the sake of shonen stoic hero mystique? The dude was such a try-hard cock. Suijitsu could barely function with Karen and Yugo around, along with the free wanker pheromones they expelled into the air. 3 more of them and he might as well just buy himself a grave. Suzuki could only parry so many knickers his admirers tossed his way. Sometimes, Suijitsu pitied him, for the wonkers woes life had thrust on him were a great burden. Poor thing, he was only an adolescent. Suzuki did not say any more, turned around, started walking with a steady gait towards the light dots that glimpsed in the valley. Suijitsu gazed over his shoulder at the manor one last time and followed him, the stain burned brightly in his mind. A flock of birds darted out over the water and skimmed the lake. He stood there under the sky when the sun was brightest. A warm hue burnt its way down the side of his cheek. It was a warm day, and leaves had lost their luster, yellowed on the ground. Upon crunching leaves, autumn's signs came. Slithering lights, bright and yellow, descended on waves, their undersides a flower green as they fell with a muted cadence on the shore. Mist was rising from Earth's exhaling pores, and soon, the ground would be a thrall to its presence. A young girl came out from between the forest's maze that wore a weary bloom, her feet crushing the leaves, and he turned a little to look at her countenance. She had arranged the red hair with curious curls over the forehead today. She whiffed the air and wrinkled her small nose, and pink freckles there came closer to appear as red dots on her cheeks. "It's getting cold. We've got to make it back before the nightfall," she said in a chiming sort of voice and placed her hand on the tree behind her. He turned his head away and gazed at the lake. Its quietness was a song. Beyond its shores, trees stood with a sheen of moisture on their limbs. Soon, dark would rise from their midst and spill over the lake to deepen its face. Then moonlights would glide alongside the dark waters, sing to the forest. This had been a strange mission. He was asked to deliver a message to a man at an outpost. He went there with her when the sun was cold and the land's contours, dim. A drizzle hindered his vision, so he had drawn out his sherry non to see better. The man was a fat one, and he looked at him strange. His frumpy apparel did not make him seem any more presentable. Suzuki took the message from his pudgy hand. The man was a little eager to grasp his hand in his and stroke the skin in suggestive motions, and left before indifference drained from his face to be replaced by annoyance. The girl had been chirpy and matched his pace to make haste to the next meeting point. The storm's anger only grew. White sparks made the forest bright and bled dry the shade's colors in a scroll that diluted in rain. A wolf, lost and hungry in the forest, had stood in their path. It growled, unafraid of lightning's temper, and contracted its muzzle to snarl a challenge. Then it lunged, feet propelling it forward to cover about 5 meters in a heartbeat, and she had hidden behind his back with a sudden whimper. He did not want to fell a hungry animal, so he pulled out his long kunao and curled his fingers firmly around the hilt to use it to his advantage. As soon as it came within an arm's reach, he slid out of the way and hit its head. The heavy hilt struck the wolf's snout. It whined and turned its head to the side and closed its eyes. Then it went skidding back across the muddy ground, unbalanced, its legs sliding and churning to find its footing. The agility of its movements was surprising. In a beat, it righted itself and showed an angry countenance to him, mouth a twisted curl around the teeth. It stalked to the left and then to the right, rumbling sounds coming from the throat's depth, but it dared not approach him in the red light that issued forth from his eyes. Its skin trembled and rippled over the visible bumps of its ribcage, its fur muddy and matted. Seeing its pitiful condition, he knew it would never survive the storm, so he reached into his bag and threw a dried-up chunk of meat, which was wrapped in a cloth, at it. He had taken it with himself just in the case the journey was prolonged. Without any hesitation, the wolf approached the cloth, sniffed it, emitted a satisfied gruff. Then it picked it up delicately between its jaws and disappeared into the forest. "Suzuki, why did you do that? We've got nothing to eat, and the next outpost is miles away." She spoke, voice ringing above the ululations of forest and wind. "It's fine, Karen, we'll find something in the forest," he said, with an air of finality, his face dark in the night. Then he walked ahead, with her floundering in his wake against the wind, to the caves up in the mountains. They had to take refuge for the night. The cave's refuge was a cold one. Suzuki and Karen placed a large rock before the mouth to keep the water from pouring inside. He lit a fire to illuminate the area. Thankfully, he had gathered dry branches from the forest in the morning. Sun was a warm companion then. Now, fire crackled and flickered in the stray wind that dumped rain droplets, from a gap above the stone, in their direction, but it was bearable. Karen had wrung her hair out till slow drops fell from the long dark tips. Her cheeks were decorated with a blush. She pouted her peach-pink mouth and crawled her way to him. It was night and he was tired, so he did not protest. "I win," she ejaculated and pressed into him. Suzuki frowned. She had made a bet that, if they did not reach the second meeting place before nightfall, he would give her what she wanted. Then she arched her neck and whispered, "Put it in. You said you'd do it if you lost. Don't you turn 12 tonight?" He did not think a storm would stop his journey, but, yes, he made a promise to her, and, yes, it was his birthday tonight. His brother had sent in a missive that he would come tomorrow. He wished that Itaki had come today. Karen curled her arms about Suzuki's neck and pressed her body against his. He was a boy of 12 now, yet he had never been embroiled in passions that involved blooming youths. At this moment, he felt a pleasure the strangest sort fill his center, roll down to the idle flesh between his thighs, swell in his loins. He had never thought of mating before. He read of it, saw it depicted in shunga and passion colors, but he never thought he would be asked to perform the act. He wanted to ask his brother, but the mere thought filled him with shame. Surely, his brother would understand that he chose to lose his virtue at an age so young? He sighed. It was a stormy night, and his body had lost the strength in the struggle to make it here. Sweat came from his skin in response to her little hand's touches. He wanted to push her away, but it would be a terrible idea in the storm. He had promised, and, if she ran out in frustration, he would have to search for her. He did not have the heart, nor the patience, for such an arduous task. So he sat in silence and felt his loins burning in the trousers with a prickly warmth. It was a new feeling. Karen strained her neck and pressed a little kiss to Suzuki's throat, and the blood there smote the skin with a visible mark. His heart thudded and sent a sinister rhythm through his veins, and his body responded with a silent bloom and sweat. Seeing his expressionless face, she grew bolder and planted open-mouthed, wet kisses along his soft jaw. He was a just boy, after all. Her hand proceeded lower and rested on the inside of his thigh. His beautiful face had a calm and mellow expression, something she had never seen before. In the dance of fire's light, she saw a glow deepen to red in his cheeks and nape. Curious of the anatomy between his legs, she stole a hesitant glance at his deep eyes and then cupped the thing, an innocent movement. A sigh slipped from Suzuki's lips that caused his eyes to shut. His nape and brow were dotted with quivering sweat drops, some crawled down his skin and drew a magnificent map over his changed countenance and flesh. Karen wore a curl of smile. She was an adolescent girl of 6, not a woman yet, and though she had lost her virtue for few coins in the past, to claim him would be a dream come true. She did not know how to play with him, yet here he was, sitting with a tempting disposition by her side, body sweat-riddled, flesh eager. She brushed her palm against that growing organ in rough strokes, and it pulsed and twitched in his trousers, demanding attention. Suzuki's brow was strained, and in his countenance was the glimmer of boyish lust. Karen's own heart was a whipping fish. The place between her legs had grown moist, aching for his flesh that grew in length and thickness. Impatient, she removed her clothes and stood with a body abloom with ruddiness in the traversing shadow cast by flames. When he heard the rustling, he watched her, confused, but did not stop her movements. Karen's flesh was tender, coated with sweat, and trembling under his gaze. She had a nice flare to her thighs, but her breasts were like that of a child's. Between her tender-tinted thighs were two fleshes that hung beyond the soft clasp of swollen lips. Mucus hung from sparse hairs that adorned her genitals. A sudden thought breached his mind, and it was so primal that he felt himself grow thicker at the prospect of a thorough exploration of her channel. Then Karen sat down and reached a hand towards Suzuki's idle one, grabbed hold of it, guided it to her genitals. He wanted to pull away, yet something in him prodded the baser half to indulge his urges. His fingers glided a smooth path down towards the groove, and to his surprise, she grew more wet, more slick. Swooning breaths came from her lips, her face lovely as it assumed the agony of a wild expression that he found most strange. Too curious, he plunged one finger inside, and the tightness made something dark thrum at the back of his head. A shade crossed his vision, Sherry Non singing, a hushed falsetto, in the chorus that resounded and rebounded in his still small body, which had yet to know of youth's heats. Karen lay down on her stomach, and her curiously wet thighs came together to create a tender seam of her buttocks, to join the slick lips and hide the warm slit that awaited his response. Suzuki took off his shirt, which felt the heaviest it had ever felt, took out his escalating arousal, and broached, with the hard flesh, her cask of pleasures, slowly, and drew a string of arousal with a backstroke. And again he pushed in, pumped fiercely, and drew out to enjoy the pull of her tight channel against his crown. He pressed his breast against her back, her hair abrading the skin, and his muscles collapsed into hers. Joined deeply, he rode her hard, mind contracted to a single dot and everything collapsed away, vibrations running through this loam house made of flesh and heated by spirit. Her gasps were a music to his ears, her sheath, a dark place that had stripped him of his thoughts and of things back home. His hips rolled, pumping full into the depths of her, setting the skin of her back and buttocks to rippling. It was bliss, nothing but the sweetest bliss, and it had whittled a piece of his spirit down to a toy for his flesh's hands. Karen's labored breaths sent the dirt on the ground puffing up, her fingers trembling beneath his. From overhead, sharp tips of dried-up tree roots let loose streamlets that fell down and hit against the skin, burning blood boiling in the venous web, muscle coils pulsing underneath the organic cover stretched to its limit. Bodies trembled, danced, writhed with a rhythm they knew by design. The press of his breast and tingling skin against hers, and she felt that her world had just begun and changed, starting from inside that place from where the vibrations originated. They scaled her flesh and wormed deep into her bones and rattled them to make muted notes. She loved him. It was love. This was love. Her body sung, in love. Colors swept through dust particles, pretty little fireflies, gliding and glimpsing right before her hazy eyes, illuminations to entice her in the flood of fire's light. His lips at her nape burnt raw, a cool fire that sizzled her flesh inside out. He grew thicker, hotter, eager to expel inside her. His soul and flesh had come together in his breast to create delicate strings, and once plucked, they produced a wondrous tremolo, and it poured forth from the tip to flood her estuary. He was spent, and his body molded into hers after the release. Then, as the feeling of frenzy mellowed and drained from Suzuki's body, he backed away, breathing harsh and ragged, and watched a vulgar mixture of arousal and semen flow from the slit between her thighs. Left streaks of white across her buttocks he had, too. There were these little vibrations in the flesh that rose from his thighs again at the sight of his own primal artistry, and he gulped. She rolled onto her back, face red, and mouth smiling, and opened her thighs wide to allow him to enter her again, and he was so charmed by tunes from his loins and lusts that he lay on her and entered the dark loam yet again. When morning came, Suzuki's demeanor had changed, much to her dismay. The storm inside him had faded, too. Outside, a light was sent spilling from between the two peaks. Ground was covered in wet leaves, soggy. So they left off, Karen in Suzuki's wake, silent, their destination another meeting place. He saw, through the cave's mouth, women bent double amidst the fields that swayed to breeze. In the wind-beaten fields, they toiled from dawn till dusk, their faces and hands dry from sun. It was dark inside the cave and wind went whistling from the crevices. A noisome odor hung heavy, smoke-like, in the corners. He could not tell if it was because of the rotten gristles or something else. A rusty smell thrummed through air, like spirits that had returned to get even. He had traveled all this way to meet a holy man, no, a boy blooming into a man. Suijitsu had told him of his countenance and stature. He said that he was young, ungainly, and a lanky fellow, said that he could talk to nature. He did not understand. It was the strangest thing, of which Suijitsu had spoken. Outside the cave, women dug at the withered earth, with tired hands. It was a poor village. Itaki had gone to perform his umbu duties again. After that last show of happy killings, Suzuki did not think he had it in him to watch the intricacies of his brother's honest profession. A flame broke out on his palm and shadows slithered further from Light's questing hands. He heard faint prayer sounds come to him from the deep. He followed, with steps light, to their source, light radiating out to hit against all corners, illuminating slick walls. Water was coming in from the roof and collecting into the breaks in the ground. Big prayer stones poked out from the earth that had not settled, moisture made it soft and muddy, their ends tapered off into fine claw-like tips. This was not done by nature, men's hands had been at work here. He saw prayer ropes tied round them, with slips of paper pasted across the surfaces. They cast shadows of a beast's claws, reaching above ground, across walls. He walked with a quiet determination towards the dark that came thickly from a large sanctum's mouth. A fetid odor pressed against his body like a gust of storm. He squeezed his nostrils together, closing them, opened his mouth to breathe, and turned away. The smell. It was unbearable. Suzuki gasped in a few breaths, but the air had a stench that seared his lungs. The foul smell permeated air's pores and noxious seedlings erupted from them in answer, teasing the air till it went rippling, carrying the smell in all directions. This sanctum had become a grave of rotten men. He turned around and saw spatters and stains on the cracked altar. They were black ink in the shadow on a stone scroll. Slack lines of red dripped from the stone in the light. The blood was still fresh. White light fell from the statue of a kami, propped up against the dark wall in the dirt. From its meticulously sculpted arm, a severed head dangled, with half the spine still attached to the neck. From this far, it appeared no different from a centipede. Pieces of flesh and strings of slime still clung together in a manner of cobwebs between the bones, and when light passed through, the globules shone like moth's eggs between pliant boughs. An image of a man, etched into a stone tablet, was cradled by the statue's other arm. The hand of this arm held a staff with rings, too. It was black, yet the statue was white as ash. He could not see the head, it was hidden behind the stone tablet, into which the face of a young man was etched. It was filled with colors most profound, white ash covered the face and red welled in and about the eyes, a Sheringan's imitation. The light made bright the white and his mien assumed a saintly semblance that was sublime, a kami before kami. He did not understand, yet he heard the prayers that came from the man's heart, for this kami's visage had goaded this worshipper into a hard submission. Before light's waves, he sat in a deep bow, and his body was a dark and crooked tree trunk. He rose up, delirious, sweat-soaked, enamored, and went into another deep bow, and he bowed prayer, obeisance to his lord, body shaking in abject servitude, tingling in the holy song's rapture. A stream filled a natural stone basin and ash mantled in the basin, floating like more eggs. Kami's eyes, downcast, looked upon water in silence, as it went over the brim with a foamy froth and fell on dirt in quiet splashes. He had burnt human flesh in the hearth and a caustic smell was released through the fatty secretions. The stench, most unholy, flooded Suzuki's lungs like clumps of hard charcoal. He coughed out the tar filling his lungs, and the prayers stopped. Sounds of autumn made him aware of the place where he sat, a place that had its own songs. The man rose, a dark statue, in the light that still shone brightly behind him. His smeared hands bore witness to the sacrificed. His neck was adorned by a necklace of bleached bones. Human? Suzuki could not say. The large man had, by his own hands, smoothed them down to little claws, fashioned in the shapes of the large prayer stones. When he turned a little, Suzuki beheld the affliction nature had wrought upon him, a scourge coursed visibly under his skin, his arm bore ridges, his hands, claws. He was a very strange man, and he rose taller in Suzuki's vision, which turned red in danger, his crumpled garments trailing down to his feet, unfurling, and the man's visage that was a veneer of fury became a veneer of adoration, a vestige of Kami's songs bygone. Then a sudden red took him to another peak, another state, and he fell down onto his knees, his outer shell receding into his skin. A song poured out from his lips, and he clasped his hands together, weeping. Autumn's wind and arms cradled his body and songs, cooling his fevers. In speech, he seemed most incapable, yet, between the ramblings and choruses, Suzuki caught his name, Yugo. Check the description for the links to the author.